at exactly 3:17 a.m. Truck driver Jake heard something that made his blood freeze. His own voice coming through the CB radio, screaming for help from a location he'd never been to. But Jake was alone in his cab, driving through the Nevada desert, and he hadn't touched his radio in hours. The voice on the frequency was begging someone to find his body before they came back, describing landmarks that didn't exist and mentioning a cargo he'd never hauled. When Jake tried to respond, his radio went dead. But the transmission continued on every frequency he tried. 3 days later, police found an abandoned truck matching Jake's description at the exact coordinates his other voice had given. But Jake was still driving, still alive, still hearing his own desperate pleas echoing through the static every night at 3:17 a.m. If you've ever experienced something that defied explanation on the road, share your story in the comments below and subscribe to Verified Fears for more true horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. At exactly 3:17 a.m., truck driver Jake was cruising down the lonely Nevada desert highway. The only sound in his cab, the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of his CB radio. The night was unusually still, the moon casting eerie shadows across the barren landscape. Jake had been on the road for hours, his mind drifting between exhaustion and the hypnotic rhythm of the road. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions. A vast expanse of nothingness, punctuated only by the occasional Joshua tree or abandoned gas station. Jake had driven this route countless times over his 15-year career as a long-haul trucker. But tonight felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air, a sense of anticipation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His cargo hold was filled with electronics bound for Los Angeles, a routine run that should have been completed without incident. Jake prided himself on his professionalism and punctuality, never missing a delivery deadline and always maintaining his equipment in pristine condition. His rig was his livelihood, his home away from home, and he treated it with the respect it deserved. The CB radio had been quiet for most of the night, with only the occasional trucker checking in with updates on road conditions or weather reports. Jake preferred the solitude of the late-night drives, finding peace in the rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching before his headlights. Suddenly, the static on his CB radio shifted, and a voice broke through the silence. It was his own voice, screaming for help, desperate and terrified. Jake's heart pounded as he fumbled with the radio, trying to respond. But the voice continued, describing landmarks he had never seen and a cargo he had never hauled. "Mayday, mayday. This is Jake Morrison on eastbound I-80, mile marker 247. My truck's been hijacked and I'm trapped in the sleeper compartment. They've got some kind of chemical cargo that's leaking. I can smell it burning my lungs. Please, somebody help me before they come back." Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the microphone. Mile marker 247 was still 50 miles ahead of his current position, and he was hauling electronics, not chemicals. The voice was unmistakably his own. The same slight rasp from years of smoking, the same Midwest accent he'd never been able to shake despite living in Nevada for over a decade. "This is Jake Morrison." He spoke into the microphone, his voice shaking. "I'm hearing my own transmission, but I'm not in distress. Repeat, I am not in distress." The radio crackled with static, but his other voice continued as if he hadn't spoken at all. "The men who took my truck, they're not human. I saw their faces when they thought I was unconscious. Their eyes were black, completely black, and their skin looked like it was melting, They keep talking about a harvest, about collecting something from the cargo. God help me, I think they're coming back. Jake pulled over to the shoulder, his entire body shaking. He checked his mirrors, scanning the empty desert for any sign of another vehicle. Nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated only by his truck's running lights and the pale moonlight. Confused and scared, Jake tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was a prank or some kind of interference. But the voice persisted, begging someone to find his body before they came back. The details were impossibly specific. Descriptions of a rest stop with a broken neon sign shaped like a cactus, a water tower painted with faded advertisements for a long-defunct motor oil company, and a mile marker that had been vandalized with strange symbols. "Listen to me, whoever's out there," his other voice pleaded through the static. "Don't trust the dispatcher. Olivia's been replaced. The real Olivia had a scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. This one doesn't. They're infiltrating the trucking companies, using our routes for something terrible. The cargo manifests are all lies. We're not hauling what we think we're hauling." Jake's blood ran cold. Olivia was indeed his dispatcher, and she did have a scar on her left hand from a childhood accident involving a broken bottle. He'd noticed it during his last visit to the depot. But how could his other voice know such intimate details about people in his life? The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving Jake in a suffocating silence. He sat in his cab for nearly an hour, waiting for the voice to return, but heard only the normal chatter of other truckers discussing weather conditions and fuel prices. None of them seemed to have heard the distressing transmission that had shaken Jake to his core. Eventually, Jake forced himself to continue driving, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every oncoming vehicle could be the mysterious hijackers his other voice had described. He drove through the night in a state of hypervigilance, constantly checking his mirrors and scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Over the next few days, Jake's life spiraled into a nightmare. He contacted the Nevada State Police to report the strange transmission, but they found no record of any distress calls or missing truckers matching his description. The dispatcher insisted that all drivers in their fleet were accounted for, and that no cargo had been reported stolen or hijacked. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He began researching the landmarks his other voice had described, using truck stop computers and his smartphone to search for images of rest stops with cactus-shaped neon signs and water towers with vintage advertisements. To his horror, he found them. Real locations scattered across the southwestern United States, places he had never visited but could describe in perfect detail, thanks to his other voice's desperate transmissions. The most disturbing discovery came when Jake drove to mile marker 247 on eastbound Interstate 80. Police found an abandoned truck matching his description at the exact coordinates his other self had given. But the vehicle identification number didn't match any truck in the system. The cargo hold was empty, except for strange chemical burns on the metal floor and walls, as if something corrosive had been stored there. Yet Jake was still alive, still driving, still haunted by the voice that echoed through the static every night at 3:17 a.m. The transmissions became more frequent and more detailed, painting a picture of a parallel existence where Jake had fallen victim to forces beyond his understanding. "They're using the trucks to transport something that shouldn't exist," his other voice explained during one particularly clear transmission. "The cargo looks normal on the manifests, but it's alive. It moves when you're not looking directly at it. It whispers in languages that hurt your brain to hear, and it's changing the drivers one by one." Jake began to notice changes in his fellow truckers. Drivers he had known for years seemed different. Their eyes held a distant, glassy quality, and they spoke in monotone voices about their routes and cargo. When he tried to engage them in normal conversation about their families or hobbies, they would stare at him blankly before excusing themselves. The paranoia consumed him. Jake started avoiding truck stops and rest areas, preferring to sleep in his cab at remote locations where he could see anyone approaching from miles away. He installed additional locks on his doors and began carrying a baseball bat within easy reach. His sleep became fitful and interrupted, plagued by nightmares of faceless men with melting skin and black eyes. As the story unfolds, Jake encounters strange phenomena on the road. Unexplained lights hovering over the highway that followed his truck for miles before disappearing. Shadowy figures standing motionless beside the road who turn to watch him pass, and a growing sense of being watched by unseen observers. His sanity begins to fray as he tries to uncover the truth behind the mysterious transmission and the dark forces that seem to be closing in on him. The breaking point came when Jake received a call from his dispatcher, Olivia, asking him to pick up an urgent cargo shipment from a warehouse he had never heard of. The address led him to an industrial complex on the outskirts of Las Vegas, a sprawling facility surrounded by high fences and security cameras. The cargo manifest listed the contents as medical supplies. But when Jake arrived at the loading dock, the workers moved with the same glassy-eyed efficiency he had noticed in other truckers. The cargo containers were sealed with locks that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. And Jake could swear he heard something moving inside them as they were loaded onto his trailer. The workers refused to make eye contact and communicated only through hand signals and grunts. When Jake tried to inspect the manifest more closely, one of the workers grabbed his wrist with inhuman strength, leaving bruises that lasted for weeks. "You don't need to know what's inside," the worker said in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "Just drive to the destination and don't stop for anything. Don't open the cargo hold. Don't listen to the radio. And whatever you do, don't look in your mirrors after midnight." Jake wanted to refuse the shipment, but found himself unable to speak or move. It was as if his body was no longer under his control. He watched helplessly as his hands signed the delivery paperwork, and his feet carried him back to his cab. Only when he was several miles away from the warehouse did he regain control of his actions. That night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., his other voice returned with a message that chilled him to the bone. "Jake, if you're hearing this, then they've gotten to you too. The cargo you're carrying isn't medical supplies. It's eggs, thousands of them, and they're about to hatch. You have maybe 6 hours before they break out of their containers and start looking for hosts. You need to get that truck as far away from populated areas as possible and find a way to destroy it before it's too late." Jake pulled over and ran to the back of his trailer, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the lock. The containers were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with a rhythmic heartbeat. Through the metal walls, he could hear a wet, sliding sound, like something large moving through thick liquid. "Don't open them," his other voice screamed through the radio. "If you open them now, they'll imprint on you. You'll become their first host, and they'll use your body to spread to others. Drive to the coordinates I'm about to give you. There's an old mining pit filled with acid runoff. It's the only thing that can destroy them." The coordinates led Jake deep into the Nevada desert, to an abandoned copper mine that had been closed for decades due to environmental contamination. The pit was filled with a toxic soup of chemicals that glowed with an eerie green phosphorescence in the moonlight. Jake backed his trailer to the edge of the pit and began the process of unhitching it, his hands working frantically as strange sounds emanated from the cargo containers. Just as he released the final coupling, the containers burst open with a sound like breaking glass. What emerged defied description. Writhing masses of translucent flesh covered in rows of needle-sharp teeth, moving with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence far beyond anything terrestrial. They immediately began searching for Jake, their movements becoming more coordinated as they communicated through subsonic vibrations that made his bones ache. Jake dove into his cab and gunned the engine, watching in his mirrors as the trailer and its horrible cargo tumbled into the acid pit. The creature's death screams were audible even over the roar of his diesel engine, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The pit bubbled and hissed as the acid consumed the alien spawn, sending up clouds of toxic vapor that glowed against the night sky. But Jake's relief was short-lived. As he drove away from the mining pit, his radio crackled to life once more. "You did well, Jake," his other voice said. But now it sounded different, colder, more mechanical. But that was just the first shipment. There are dozens more trucks out there carrying the same cargo to cities across the country. And now that you've proven yourself capable of handling the truth, you're going to help us stop them. The story delves into themes of identity, fate, and the thin veil between reality and nightmare, culminating in Jake's realization that he may not be the original Jake Morrison at all, but rather a copy created by the same forces that had replaced his dispatcher and fellow truckers. The midnight radio transmissions weren't coming from another version of himself, but from the real Jake Morrison, trapped in a parallel dimension and desperately trying to warn his replacement about the invasion taking place in their reality. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Jake Morrison, or the thing that believed itself to be Jake Morrison, continued driving toward his next destination, carrying orders that had been programmed into his synthetic memories. Behind him, the acid pit continued to bubble and smoke. But something had survived the chemical bath. Something that was already beginning to regenerate, to adapt, to evolve. The real Jake Morrison's voice continued to echo through the static, growing fainter with each transmission, as the barriers between dimensions slowly crumbled, and the harvest began in earnest. The highways of America had become conduits for an invasion that most people would never see coming, carried out by drivers who no longer remembered being human, and cargo that defied every law of nature. If you've ever felt the road whisper secrets in the dead of night, if you've ever heard your own voice calling for help from places you've never been, then you know that some transmissions are more than just radio interference. They're warnings from those who came before, desperate messages from the spaces between realities, where the original Jake Morrison and countless others wait in the static, hoping someone will hear their cries and understand the terrible truth about what travels our highways after midnight. Let's move to our second story. The sun had already disappeared behind the rolling hills of Tennessee when James pulled his 18-wheeler into the gravel lot of the Mountain View rest area. After 14 hours of driving through winding mountain roads, his body ached and his eyes burned from the strain of navigating the treacherous curves that snaked through the Appalachian foothills. The rest area was one of those forgotten places that seemed frozen in time, with weathered picnic tables, rusted trash cans, and a single flickering street light that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. James had been hauling freight for nearly 2 decades, and he prided himself on knowing every truck stop, rest area, and safe haven between Atlanta and Pittsburgh. This particular stop wasn't on any official maps or trucking guides. but veteran drivers whispered about it in CB radio conversations. A place where you could park for the night without being hassled by state troopers or lot lizards looking to make a quick buck. It was isolated enough to guarantee peace and quiet, nestled between two steep ridges that blocked out most of the noise from the interstate below. The October air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and James could smell wood smoke drifting down from the scattered cabins that dotted the mountainside. He'd always found something comforting about these remote Appalachian communities, where people still lived by the old ways and minded their own business. It was a stark contrast to the bustling cities where he made most of his deliveries, places where everyone seemed to be in a hurry, and nobody had time for a friendly conversation. As James performed his routine post-drive inspection, checking tire pressure and securing his load of construction materials bound for a job site in West Virginia, he noticed another vehicle in the lot. A beat-up pickup truck sat at the far end of the rest area, its rusted body barely visible in the dim light. The truck looked like it had been there for hours, maybe even days, with leaves scattered across its windshield and what appeared to be a thick layer of dust coating its faded blue paint. Something about the abandoned vehicle made James uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the way it sat at an odd angle, as if it had been parked hastily, or the fact that one of its doors hung slightly ajar. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were telling him that something wasn't right about this place. James decided to investigate, thinking that perhaps someone needed help. Breakdowns were common in these mountain areas, where cell phone service was spotty and the nearest tow truck might be hours away. He'd helped stranded motorists countless times over the years, and it was an unwritten code among truckers to lend assistance when possible. The trucking community was like a brotherhood, bound together by the shared experiences of life on the road and the understanding that today's good deed might be tomorrow's lifeline. As he approached the pickup truck, James called out, "Hello? Anyone need help?" His voice echoed off the surrounding hills, but received no response. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the interstate and the occasional rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The truck's interior was empty, but James noticed dark stains on the driver's seat that looked suspiciously like dried blood. A chill ran down his spine as he backed away from the vehicle, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed deeper now, and every rustle of leaves made him jump. James had seen enough crime scenes during his years on the road to recognize the signs of violence, and everything about this abandoned truck screamed danger. That's when he saw the man. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light cast by the flickering street lamp, was a figure that seemed to have materialized from the darkness itself. The man was tall and gaunt, wearing what appeared to be dirty coveralls that hung loosely on his skeletal frame. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging in greasy strands around a face that James couldn't quite make out in the shadows. But what caught James's attention immediately was what the man held in his right hand. A large pipe wrench, easily 2 feet long, that gleamed dully in the pale light. The tool looked heavy and well used, with dark stains along its metal surface that James didn't want to think about too closely. The man wasn't moving, just standing there like a scarecrow. But his eyes, even from this distance, James could feel them boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way the figure stood. Too still, too patient, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. James's first instinct was to offer help, thinking perhaps the man was the owner of the abandoned truck and needed assistance. "Hey there," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady and friendly. You having car trouble? I might be able to help." The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that James had spoken. He just continued to stare with those cold, dead eyes that seemed to reflect the streetlight like an animal's. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of James's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Something deep in James's gut told him to get back to his truck immediately. This wasn't a stranded motorist in need of assistance. This was something else entirely, something dangerous and unpredictable. He'd heard stories from other truckers about encounters with unstable individuals at remote rest stops, people who lived on the fringes of society and preyed on unsuspecting travelers. "Okay, well, if you don't need help, I'll just be heading back to my truck," James said, taking a slow step backward while keeping his eyes on the motionless figure. He didn't want to turn his back on the man, but he also didn't want to make any sudden movements that might provoke an attack. That's when the man moved. Without warning, the figure suddenly lunged forward with a speed that seemed impossible for someone of his apparent age and condition. The pipe wrench was raised above his head, like a medieval war hammer, and a sound escaped his throat that was part scream, part animal growl. His face, now visible in the light, was a mask of pure rage and madness, with wild eyes and bared teeth that looked more like fangs than human dental work. James's military training from his younger days kicked in, and he spun around and ran toward his truck with every ounce of speed he could muster. Behind him, he could hear the man's footsteps pounding against the gravel, accompanied by that inhuman howling that raised every hair on the back of his neck. The sound of the heavy wrench cutting through the air was audible even over his own labored breathing. The distance to his truck seemed to stretch on forever, like something out of a nightmare where you run and run, but never seem to get any closer to safety. James could feel the man gaining on him, could almost feel the cold metal of the wrench whistling past his head. His lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but the adrenaline coursing through his system kept him moving. Just as James reached his cab and grabbed the door handle, he felt something brush against his back, the wrench missing him by mere inches and striking the side of his truck with a resounding clang that echoed through the mountains. The impact left a significant dent in the metal paneling, a testament to the incredible force behind the blow. James threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the lock. Through the window, he could see the man standing just outside, still holding the wrench and staring at him with those terrible eyes. The attacker began pounding on the door with the tool, each blow sending vibrations through the entire cab and spiderwebbing the safety glass. The assault continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with the man circling the truck and striking it repeatedly while screaming incoherently. James tried to start the engine, but his hands were shaking so badly that he kept missing the ignition switch. The sound of metal on metal was deafening, and James was certain that the man would eventually break through one of the windows and drag him out into the darkness. Finally, James managed to get the engine started and threw the transmission into gear. As the truck lurched forward, he saw the man in his rearview mirror, still standing in the parking lot and watching him leave. Even as the distance increased, James could see that terrible figure silhouetted against the streetlight, motionless once again, but somehow even more menacing in his stillness. James drove non-stop for 50 miles, his heart pounding and his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Every shadow on the roadside looked like a potential threat. Every oncoming vehicle could be the madman somehow following him. The rationale part of his mind knew that the man couldn't possibly have kept up with a semi-truck, but the primal fear that had taken hold of him wasn't interested in logic. When he finally felt safe enough to stop at a well-lit truck stop with plenty of other vehicles around, James called the Tennessee State Police to report the incident. The dispatcher took his statement seriously and promised to send a patrol car to investigate the rest area. But James had a sinking feeling that they wouldn't find anything. "Sir, can you describe the individual who attacked you?" the dispatcher asked. James tried to put into words what he had seen. But how do you describe someone who seemed more like a force of nature than a human being? He was tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", wearing dirty coveralls, long, greasy hair. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were completely empty, like looking into a void. And he moved wrong, you know? Too fast, too aggressive, like he wasn't quite human. The dispatcher assured James that they would investigate thoroughly and advised him to seek medical attention if he felt he needed it. But James knew that no doctor could treat what was really wrong with him. The knowledge that there were people out there who existed outside the normal boundaries of human behavior, predators who lurked in the shadows waiting for unsuspecting victims. 3 hours later, the state police called James back with an update that chilled him to the bone. They had found the rest area exactly as he had described it, complete with the abandoned pickup truck and the dents in the gravel where the struggle had taken place, but there was no sign of the man with the wrench. The truck was registered to a Harold Wickham, age 67, who was reported missing by his family 3 weeks ago. The officer explained. "We found evidence of a struggle inside the vehicle, including blood spatter that suggests foul play. But whoever did this is long gone." James realized with growing horror that he had likely encountered Harold Wickham's killer, someone who had been using the remote rest area as a hunting ground for unsuspecting travelers. The abandoned truck wasn't just evidence of a breakdown, it was a trophy, a reminder of a successful hunt. "Officer, you need to check the woods around that rest area," James said urgently. "I have a feeling you're going to find more than just one missing person." The investigation that followed would uncover the remains of 7 individuals buried in shallow graves throughout the surrounding forest. Victims who had made the fatal mistake of stopping at the Mountain View rest area over the past 2 years. The killer was never found, despite an extensive manhunt that involved multiple law enforcement agencies and search teams with tracking dogs. James never drove through Tennessee again without thinking about that night and the man with the wrench. He'd come within seconds of becoming another statistic, another missing person whose fate would remain a mystery to his family and friends. The incident changed him in ways that were hard to articulate. He became more cautious, more aware of his surroundings, and less trusting of isolated places that had once seemed peaceful and safe. Sometimes, late at night when he was driving through remote areas, James would catch a glimpse of a figure standing by the roadside, and his heart would race with the memory of those cold, dead eyes. He'd learned that evil could take many forms, but the most terrifying was when it looked human while being something else entirely. The Mountain View rest area was eventually closed by the state, and the access road was barricaded, but James knew that wouldn't stop someone like the man with the wrench. Predators like that simply moved on to new hunting grounds, new places where they could wait in the shadows for their next victim. And somewhere out there, in another forgotten rest area or abandoned truck stop, James was certain that the man was still waiting, still holding that blood-stained wrench, still searching for the next traveler who would make the mistake of offering help to a stranger in the darkness. The most disturbing part wasn't the violence or the near-death experience. It was the realization that if James had arrived just 10 minutes earlier or later, if he had parked in a different spot or taken a different route, he might never have seen the danger until it was too late. The randomness of it all, the thin line between safety and horror, was what kept him awake during those long nights on the road. Because in the end, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in horror movies or urban legends. They're the ones that look like ordinary people until the moment they reveal their true nature. And by then, it's usually too late to run. Let's move to our third story. The fog rolled in thick that November night as Danny pulled his rig into the Moonlight Truck Plaza just outside of Bakersfield, California. He'd been driving for 16 straight hours, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Phoenix to Sacramento, and his eyelids felt like sandpaper against his eyes. The truck stop was one of those 24-hour operations that catered to the endless stream of long-haul drivers who kept America's supply chains moving, complete with diesel pumps, a diner that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and a small convenience store stocked with energy drinks and questionable hot dogs. Danny had been trucking for 12 years, ever since his discharge from the Army, and he'd developed a sixth sense about people and places that didn't feel right. Tonight, that sense was screaming at him. But exhaustion overruled caution. Federal regulations mandated rest periods, and he was already pushing the legal limits of his driving time. One more violation would cost him his commercial license, and at 43 years old with 2 kids in college, he couldn't afford to lose his livelihood. The truck plaza was busier than usual for a Tuesday night, with at least a dozen big rigs scattered across the parking lot like sleeping giants. Danny found a spot near the back, away from the main building but close enough to the security lights to feel relatively safe. He'd learned over the years that the best parking spots were the ones that offered multiple escape routes while maintaining good visibility of the surrounding area. As he shut down his engine and began his post-trip inspection, Danny noticed 2 figures standing near the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden in the shadows cast by a broken streetlight. At first glance, they appeared to be having a conversation, but something about their body language struck him as odd. They stood too close together, their movements too synchronized, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. The first figure was a man in his 60s, wearing a stained mechanic's jumpsuit that had seen better days. His gray hair was slicked back with what looked like motor oil. And even from a distance, Danny could see the man's hands moving in strange, repetitive gestures. The second figure was harder to make out. Shorter, wearing what appeared to be a long coat or dress that hung loosely on a skeletal frame. Danny tried to ignore them, focusing instead on checking his trailer connections and securing his load. But as he worked, he became increasingly aware that the 2 figures were watching him. Every time he glanced in their direction, they seemed to have moved slightly closer, though he never actually saw them walking. It was like they were drifting across the asphalt, defying the normal laws of movement and physics. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and Danny's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he finished his inspection. He was looking forward to climbing into his sleeper compartment and getting some much-needed rest before the final push to Sacramento in the morning. But as he walked around to the driver's side of his cab, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Someone had been rubbing something on the side of his trailer. The substance looked like grease or oil, but it had an iridescent quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the artificial light. The marks formed a pattern that hurt Danny's eyes to look at directly. Geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating optical illusions that made his head spin. The smell was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with ozone, and something else that reminded him of his grandmother's basement after it flooded. "Hey!" Danny hollered at the 2 figures, his voice echoing across the parking lot. "What the hell are you doing to my truck?" The man in the jumpsuit looked up and smiled, revealing teeth that were far too white and far too sharp for any human mouth. Without breaking eye contact, he began walking toward Danny with a gait that was somehow both casual and predatory. His companion followed, and as she moved into the light, Danny saw that what he had mistaken for a coat was actually her skin, pale, translucent flesh that hung in loose folds around her emaciated frame. Danny backed toward his cab, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol he kept in his door panel. He'd never had to draw his weapon in all his years on the road, but he'd always known this day might come. The trucking life exposed you to all kinds of people, and not all of them had good intentions. "Now hold on there, friend," the man called out, his voice carrying an accent that Danny couldn't place. "We're just trying to help you out. Your rig's got some bad energy around it, and we're trying to cleanse it for you." Danny climbed into his cab and locked the door, but he could see both figures approaching in his mirrors. The woman, if that's what she was, had moved around to the passenger side and was now standing on his step, pressing her face against the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she smiled, revealing gums that were black with decay and teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. The man jumped up on the driver's side step and began licking the window with a tongue that was far too long and covered in what looked like small barbs. His eyes never left Danny's face as he performed this grotesque display, and Danny could hear him making soft, cooing sounds like a dove. "Open up, driver," the woman said, her voice muffled by the glass but still audible. "We just want to talk to you about your cargo. We know what you're really hauling, and we can help you dispose of it properly." Danny's cargo manifest listed agricultural equipment, tractors, plows, and irrigation systems bound for farms in the Central Valley. But as the woman spoke, he began to remember strange details about the loading process that he dismissed at the time. The warehouse workers had been unusually secretive, covering the equipment with tarps and refusing to let him inspect the load. The paperwork had been rushed, and the shipping company had paid him in cash rather than the usual electronic transfer. The truck began to rock as both figures started pounding on the windows with increasing intensity. The woman was using her fists, leaving bloody smears on the glass, while the man had produced what looked like a crowbar from somewhere in his jumpsuit. The sound of metal on glass was deafening in the confined space of the cab, and Danny was certain that they would break through at any moment. "Let us in," the man screamed, his voice rising to an inhuman pitch. "We know you can hear them calling. The cargo is alive, and it wants to come home." As if summoned by his words, Danny began to hear sounds coming from his trailer, scratching, scraping noises like fingernails on metal, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversations in a language he didn't recognize. The trailer began to sway slightly, as if something large was moving around inside it. Danny fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely grip them. The engine turned over on the third try, and he threw the transmission into gear without bothering to warm up the diesel. As the truck lurched forward, he saw the man lose his grip and fall to the asphalt. But the woman managed to hold on, her fingers somehow finding purchase on the smooth metal of the door frame. She rode alongside the cab for nearly a quarter mile, her face pressed against the passenger window and her mouth moving in what looked like a silent chant. Her eyes had turned completely black, and Danny could see his own reflection multiplied dozens of times in their dark depths. Finally, she let go and tumbled into the darkness behind him. But her laughter followed the truck for miles down the highway. Danny drove without stopping until he reached Sacramento, his heart pounding and his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold night air. When he finally arrived at the delivery site, he was shocked to discover that his trailer was empty. The agricultural equipment that had been loaded in Phoenix was gone, leaving only strange burn marks on the trailer floor and the lingering smell of ozone and decay. The shipping company claimed no knowledge of the missing cargo, and the insurance investigation turned up nothing. The warehouse in Phoenix had been abandoned for months, according to local authorities, and the paperwork Danny had signed bore the names of people who didn't exist. He was left with an empty trailer, a damaged truck, and memories that no one would believe. But the most disturbing part came weeks later, when Danny was watching the evening news and saw a report about a series of disappearances in small farming communities throughout the Central Valley. Entire families had vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty houses and fields that had been stripped bare of all vegetation. The reporter mentioned that witnesses had seen strange lights moving through the affected areas, accompanied by sounds that defied description. Danny knew with absolute certainty that whatever he had been hauling that night was connected to these disappearances. The woman and her companion hadn't been trying to rob him. They'd been trying to stop something far worse from reaching its destination. And he had delivered it right into the heart of California's agricultural region, where it could spread and multiply among the isolated farms and rural communities. Sometimes, late at night when he was driving through farming areas, Danny would see lights moving through the fields and hear sounds that reminded him of that terrible night at the Moonlight Truck Plaza. He'd learned to avoid certain routes, certain truck stops, and certain shipping companies that paid too well for jobs that seemed too simple, because he knew now that not all cargo was what it appeared to be, and not all deliveries were meant for human recipients. Some loads were destined for things that lived in the spaces between our world and others, creatures that used the trucking industry's vast network to spread their influence across the continent. And somewhere out there, the woman with the translucent skin and her companion were still waiting, still trying to intercept shipments that should never reach their destinations. They were the last line of defense against an invasion that most people would never see coming, fighting a war that would never make the evening news. Danny never took another cash job after that night, and he always inspected his cargo personally before leaving the loading dock. But he knew that his vigilance might not be enough, because the enemy had learned to hide in plain sight, using the very systems that kept society functioning to spread their corruption across the land. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the things that use it to travel between worlds. Let's move to our fourth story. The headlights of Rick's Peterbilt cut through the pre-dawn darkness as he navigated the winding two-lane highway through rural Montana. It was 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September, and the world felt empty except for the steady rumble of his diesel engine and the occasional deer that would dart across the road like gray phantoms. Rick had been driving this route for 8 years, hauling lumber from the mills in Missoula to construction sites in Denver. And he knew every curve, every hill, and every mile marker by heart. The stretch of highway he was currently traveling was particularly desolate. 30 miles of asphalt cutting through dense pine forests and rolling meadows, with no towns, no gas stations, and no cell phone coverage. It was the kind of road where you could drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, where the silence was so complete that it seemed to press against your eardrums like a physical weight. Rick preferred these lonely highways to the busy interstates where you had to constantly watch for aggressive drivers and road rage incidents. Out here, the only dangers were wildlife, weather, and the occasional drunk driver weaving home from a bar in some forgotten town. He'd learned to appreciate the solitude, using the quiet hours to think about his life, his family, and his plans for retirement in a few years. But tonight felt different somehow. there was a tension in the air that Rick couldn't quite identify, a sense of anticipation that made the hair on his arms stand up. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows between the trees deeper and more impenetrable. Even the wildlife was behaving strangely. He'd seen several deer standing motionless beside the road, their eyes reflecting his headlights, but their bodies frozen in unnatural poses. Rick was about 15 miles from the nearest town when he saw something in the road ahead that made him ease off the accelerator and lean forward in his seat. At first, he thought it might be another deer, but as his headlights illuminated the object more clearly, he realized it was something far more disturbing. There, sprawled across both lanes of the highway, was what appeared to be a human body. Rick's military training from his younger days kicked in, and he began scanning the area for potential threats while simultaneously slowing his rig. Ambushes were rare on American highways, but not unheard of, and the isolated location made this situation particularly dangerous. He reached for his CB radio to call for help, but remembered that he was in a dead zone where no signals could get through. As he got closer, Rick could see that the figure was lying face down in an unnatural position, arms and legs splayed at odd angles that suggested either severe injury or death. The person appeared to be wearing dark clothing, possibly jeans and a jacket, but it was difficult to make out details in the harsh glare of his headlights. Rick brought his truck to a complete stop about 50 feet from the body, leaving his engine running and his headlights trained on the scene. He grabbed his flashlight and his pistol from the door panel, then stepped out of the cab to investigate. The night air was cold and still, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else. A metallic smell that reminded him of blood. "Hello?" Rick called out as he approached the figure. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no response, no movement, no sign of life. Rick moved closer, his flashlight beam dancing across the asphalt as he tried to get a better look at what he was dealing with. The closer he got, the more wrong everything seemed. The body was positioned too perfectly, too deliberately, as if someone had carefully arranged it for maximum visual impact. The limbs were spread in a pattern that almost looked ritualistic, and there were no skid marks on the road to suggest a vehicle accident. Most disturbing of all, Rick couldn't see any blood, despite the fact that the person appeared to have suffered massive trauma. When Rick was about 10 feet away, he stopped and played his flashlight beam over the entire scene, trying to process what he was seeing. The figure was definitely human, but something about the proportions seemed off. The torso was too long, the limbs too thin, and the head was positioned at an angle that should have been impossible for a living person. That's when he noticed the smell. It wasn't blood after all, but something far worse, the sickly, sweet odor of advanced decomposition mixed with chemicals that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. The body had been there for days, maybe weeks, but somehow it looked fresh, as if death had occurred only hours ago. Rick backed away from the scene, his instincts screaming that this was a trap of some kind. He'd heard stories from other truckers about bodies being used as bait to stop vehicles, allowing criminals to rob or carjack unsuspecting drivers. But this felt different, more calculated, more sinister than a simple highway robbery. As he retreated toward his truck, Rick heard a sound that made his blood freeze. A wet, sliding noise like something large moving across the asphalt. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the road. But the body was exactly where he'd left it. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. Rick ran back to his cab and climbed inside, locking the doors and grabbing his CB radio. Even though he knew he was in a dead zone, he tried calling for help anyway, broadcasting on the emergency channel and hoping that someone, somewhere, might pick up his signal. Mayday, Mayday. This is eastbound on Highway 200 mile marker 47. I've got a possible fatality in the roadway and I need immediate assistance. There's something wrong here. Something really wrong. The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. Rick was completely alone with whatever was happening outside his truck. He looked back at the body and saw something that made him question his sanity. The figure was moving, not like a living person trying to get up, but like something being dragged or manipulated by an unseen force. The limbs twitched and jerked in unnatural ways, and the head began to turn slowly toward his truck. When the face came into view, Rick saw that it wasn't human at all. The features were wrong, too sharp, too angular, with eyes that reflected his headlights like an animal's. The mouth was open in what might have been a scream, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that belonged in the mouth of a deep-sea predator, not a human being. The skin had a waxy, artificial quality, as if it were a mask or prosthetic designed to fool observers from a distance. The thing that had been masquerading as a human corpse began to move with increasing coordination, first pushing itself up on its arms, then rising to its feet with a fluid grace that defied the laws of anatomy. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its limbs elongated and twisted, its head cocked at an impossible angle as it studied Rick's truck with those terrible, glowing eyes. Rick threw his transmission into gear and floored the accelerator, his truck lurching forward as the diesel engine roared to life. In his mirrors, he could see the creature watching him leave, standing motionless in the middle of the highway like a scarecrow. But as the distance increased, Rick realized with growing horror that the thing was following him. It didn't run or walk. It simply appeared closer to his truck with each glance in the mirror, covering impossible distances in the blink of an eye. The creature moved with a stuttering, stop-motion quality, like frames missing from an old film reel. One moment, it would be a quarter-mile behind him. The next, it would be only a few hundred yards away, gaining ground despite the fact that Rick was doing 70 miles per hour. The chase continued for miles, with the creature maintaining its impossible pursuit while Rick pushed his truck to its mechanical limits. The engine temperature gauge climbed dangerously high, and he could smell burning oil and overheated metal, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, the thing that had pretended to be a human corpse continued its relentless advance, its glowing eyes never leaving his truck. Just as Rick thought his engine was about to seize, he crested a hill and saw the lights of a small town spread out in the valley below. The sight of civilization gave him hope, and he began laying on his horn and flashing his headlights, trying to wake up anyone who might be able to help him. As soon as his truck crossed the town limits, the creature vanished. Rick pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner and sat in his cab for nearly an hour, shaking and trying to process what had happened. When he finally worked up the courage to call the local sheriff's department, they sent a deputy to take his statement, but the officer clearly thought Rick was either drunk or suffering from hallucinations brought on by too many hours on the road. "Sir, we get calls like this maybe once or twice a year," the deputy explained patiently. "Long-haul drivers, isolated highways, sleep deprivation. It's a perfect recipe for seeing things that aren't there. Why don't you get some rest and see how you feel in the morning?" But Rick knew what he had seen, and he knew it wasn't a hallucination. The next day, he drove back to mile marker 47 with a state trooper. But they found nothing. No body, no evidence of any kind of disturbance, just empty highway stretching through the forest. The trooper was sympathetic but firm. Sometimes the mind plays tricks on us, especially when we're tired and stressed. There's no shame in it. Happens to the best of us. Rick never drove that stretch of highway again, choosing instead to take a longer route that added 2 hours to his trip, but kept him on busier roads with more traffic and better cell phone coverage. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, still using the isolated highways to hunt for victims. Over the following months, Rick began researching similar incidents and found a disturbing pattern. Truckers across the country had reported encounters with bodies in the road that turned out to be something else entirely. Things that used human appearance as camouflage to lure unsuspecting drivers into stopping. Most of these reports were dismissed as hallucinations or hoaxes. But Rick knew better. The creatures were real, and they were using America's highway system as their hunting ground. They understood human psychology well enough to know that most people would stop to help what appeared to be an injured person, and they exploited that compassion to get close to their prey. Rick started carrying more weapons in his truck and installed additional lighting and communication equipment. He also began sharing his story with other drivers, warning them about the dangers of stopping for bodies in the road, especially on isolated highways where help was far away. Some truckers listened, but most dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a man who'd spent too many years on the road. They couldn't accept that there were things out there that looked human, but weren't. Predators that had learned to mimic our appearance and exploit our instincts for their own dark purposes. But Rick knew the truth, and he carried that knowledge with him every time he climbed into his cab and headed out onto the highway. Somewhere in the darkness between cities, between the safe harbors of civilization, things were waiting that defied explanation and challenged everything we thought we knew about the world. The road was full of dangers that no driving manual could prepare you for, and the most terrifying ones were the ones that looked like they needed help. Let's move to our fifth story. The Wyoming wind howled across the empty plains as Michael guided his Kenworth through the darkness, hauling a load of industrial machinery from Detroit to Seattle. It was nearly 2 a.m. on a moonless Thursday night in February, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. The kind of cold that could kill you in minutes if your truck broke down in the wrong place. The kind of cold that made the metal of your rig contract and groan like a living thing in pain. Michael had been driving professionally for 23 years, and he'd learned to respect the power of winter weather in the mountain states. He kept extra blankets, emergency food, and a satellite phone in his cab, along with enough diesel fuel to run his engine for days if he got stranded. The Wyoming stretch of Interstate 80 was notorious for sudden blizzards that could turn a routine drive into a life-or-death survival situation. But tonight the weather was clear, just brutally cold, with stars scattered across the sky like broken glass. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of his headlights, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through a landscape so desolate it might as well have been the surface of another planet. Michael had driven this route hundreds of times, but the isolation never failed to impress him. Mile after mile of nothing but sagebrush, wind, and the occasional antelope herd moving like ghosts through the darkness. He was about 40 miles east of Laramie when his CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that made him sit up straighter in his seat. The voice was female, young, and filled with terror that cut through the static like a knife. "Please, somebody help me. I'm trapped in a truck at mile marker 235. He's coming back, and I don't think I can hide much longer. If anyone can hear this, please call the police. Please." Michael grabbed his microphone and responded immediately. "This is eastbound on I-80. I copy your transmission. What's your location and what kind of help do you need?" The radio fell silent for several long seconds. Then the woman's voice returned, even more frightened than before. "I don't know exactly where I am. I was hitchhiking and this trucker picked me up. But something's wrong with him. He's not normal. I managed to lock myself in the sleeper compartment, but he knows I'm in here." Michael checked his GPS and saw the mile marker 235 was still 15 miles ahead of his current position. He pressed the accelerator, pushing his truck faster than was safe on the icy highway, while trying to maintain radio contact with the terrified woman. "What's your name, miss?" "I'm Michael, and I'm heading your way right now. Can you describe the truck you're in?" "My name is Sarah," the voice replied, barely audible through the static. "It's a blue Peterbilt with flames painted on the sides. The driver said his name was Carl, but when I looked at his logbook, it had a different name. And his eyes... God. His eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just black." Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. He'd heard stories from other truckers about drivers who weren't quite right, people who used the anonymity of the highway to prey on vulnerable hitchhikers and stranded motorists. But the detail about the black eyes was something new. Something that suggested this situation was far worse than a simple predator. "Sarah, I need you to stay calm and keep that door locked. I'm going to be there in about 10 minutes, and I'm calling the state police right now." Michael reached for his satellite phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The display showed no signal, which was impossible. Satellite phones were designed to work anywhere on Earth. He tried again with the same result, then switched to his CB radio to call for help from other truckers. "Breaker, this is eastbound I-80 at mile marker 220. I've got a female in distress at marker 235, requesting immediate assistance from any units in the area." The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. It was as if every communication device in his truck had suddenly stopped working, leaving him completely cut off from the outside world. Sarah's voice returned, more panicked than before. "He's back. He's trying to get into the sleeper. Oh God, he's not using the door handle. He's doing something to the metal. It's bending like it's made of clay." Michael could hear sounds in the background of Sarah's transmission. A low humming noise, like an electrical transformer, accompanied by what sounded like metal being twisted and reshaped. The sounds were unlike anything he'd ever heard, mechanical yet organic, as if the truck itself was being transformed by some impossible force. "Sarah, can you see anything? Is there a weapon in the sleeper you can use to defend yourself?" "There's a crowbar under the bunk, but I don't think it would help." "Michael, this thing isn't human. I can see its shadow through the curtain, and it's too tall, too thin. And the smell. It smells like burning copper and rotting meat." Michael crested a hill and saw lights ahead. A truck parked on the shoulder of the highway, with its hazard lights flashing. As he got closer, he could see that it matched Sarah's description. A blue Peterbilt with flame decals, sitting at an odd angle as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. But something was wrong with the truck's appearance. The metal seemed to be moving, rippling like water, and the flames painted on the sides appeared to be actually burning, casting flickering shadows across the snow-covered ground. The trailer behind the cab was swaying back and forth, despite the fact that there was no wind strong enough to move a loaded semi-trailer. Michael pulled his truck to a stop about 100 yards away and grabbed his shotgun from behind his seat. He'd never had to use it in all his years on the road, but he'd always known this day might come. The trucking life exposed you to all kinds of dangers, and some of them couldn't be handled with words or common sense. "Sarah, I'm here. I can see the truck. I'm coming to get you out." "No!" Sarah's voice screamed through the radio. "Don't come closer. It's not just the driver. The whole truck is wrong. It's alive somehow, and it's hungry. I can feel it trying to get inside my head, trying to make me open the door." As Michael watched, the blue Peterbilt began to change more dramatically. The cab stretched and elongated, taking on an organic quality that made his stomach turn. What had appeared to be chrome exhaust stacks were now writhing like tentacles, and the windshield had become a cluster of black eyes that reflected his headlights with malevolent intelligence. The thing that had been masquerading as a truck turned toward Michael's position, and he could see that the grille had transformed into a mouth filled with rows of metallic teeth. The headlights pulsed with a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat, and the diesel engine's rumble had become something closer to a growl. "Sarah, where are you in that thing? I need to know exactly where you are so I can get you out." "I'm in the sleeper compartment, but it's changing too. The walls are getting softer, and I can feel them pressing in on me." "Michael, I don't think this is a truck at all. I think it's something that looks like a truck to fool people into getting close." Michael realized with growing horror that Sarah was right. The creature had evolved the perfect camouflage for hunting on America's highways. It appeared to be a normal semi-truck, complete with a human driver, allowing it to pick up hitchhikers and stranded motorists without arousing suspicion. By the time victims realized what they were dealing with, they were already trapped inside its body. The creature began moving toward Michael's truck, not rolling on wheels but flowing across the asphalt like a massive slug. Its transformation was accelerating, with more tentacles emerging from what had been the trailer, and bioluminescent patterns appearing along its sides like the markings of a deep-sea predator. Michael threw his truck into reverse and began backing away. But the creature was faster than it looked. Tentacles shot out from its body, wrapping around his front bumper and trying to drag him closer to that terrible mouth. He could hear Sarah screaming through the radio as the creature's digestive processes began to work on the sleeper compartment where she was trapped. "Michael, help me. It's dissolving the walls. I can see outside, but everything looks wrong, like I'm inside a stomach." Michael floored the accelerator, his truck's engine straining against the creature's grip. The tentacles stretched and elongated, but finally snapped under the stress, allowing him to break free. In his mirrors, he could see the creature writhing in what might have been pain or rage, its disguise completely abandoned as it revealed its true form. The thing was enormous, easily the size of a city bus, with a body that seemed to be part machine and part organic tissue. Cables and wires hung from its underside like intestines, sparking and twitching with electrical current. Its surface was covered in what looked like license plates from dozens of different states, trophies from previous victims who had made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride. Michael drove for 20 miles before his communication equipment started working again, and he immediately called 911 to report what he had witnessed. The dispatcher was skeptical, but agreed to send a patrol car to investigate the location where he'd encountered the creature. When the state police arrived at mile marker 235, they found nothing. No truck, no evidence of any kind of disturbance, just empty highway stretching through the Wyoming wilderness. The official report listed Michael's call as a possible hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. But Michael knew what he had seen, and he knew that Sarah was still out there somewhere, trapped inside a creature that used the highway system as its hunting ground. He began researching similar incidents and found a disturbing pattern of missing hitchhikers and unexplained disappearances along major trucking routes. The creature was still out there, still hunting, still perfecting its disguise. It had learned to mimic not just the appearance of a truck, but the behavior patterns of professional drivers, complete with CB radio chatter and proper documentation. Most victims never realized they were in danger until it was too late to escape. Michael started carrying more weapons and warning other truckers about the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, especially on isolated stretches of highway where help was far away. But he knew that his warnings would only do so much good. The creature was intelligent, adaptable, and patient. It could wait years between hunts, perfecting its camouflage and studying human behavior. Somewhere on America's highways, a truck that isn't really a truck continues to prowl the darkness, searching for its next victim. And inside its body, the voices of previous prey echo through the static, calling for help that will never come, warning travelers about the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of our everyday world. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt along its endless miles. Let's move to our sixth story. The gas station's neon sign flickered erratically in the pre-dawn darkness, casting intermittent red and blue shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Tommy pulled his Freightliner into the diesel bay at Murphy's Last Stop, a rundown truck stop on the outskirts of nowhere, Nevada, where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions like a sea of sand and sagebrush. The digital clock on his dashboard read 3:47 a.m., and he'd been driving for 11 straight hours, hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City. Murphy's Last Stop was exactly the kind of place its name suggested. A final opportunity for fuel, food, and rest before venturing into the most desolate stretch of highway in the American West. The building itself looked like it had been constructed in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since, with faded paint, rusted metal siding, and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. But it was open 24 hours, the diesel was cheap, and the coffee was strong enough to keep a dead man awake. Tommy had been trucking for 15 years, ever since his discharge from the Marines, and he'd learned to appreciate these forgotten outposts of civilization. They were staffed by people who understood the trucking life, who knew that drivers needed more than just fuel. They needed a friendly face, a hot meal, and sometimes just someone to talk to during the long, lonely hours of the night. As he filled his tanks, Tommy noticed another truck pulling into the lot. A newer Peterbilt with California plates, driven by someone who looked to be about his own age. The driver parked near the building and walked inside, moving with the slightly stiff gait of someone who'd been sitting behind the wheel for too many hours. Tommy finished fueling and decided to go inside for coffee and a sandwich. Maybe strike up a conversation with a fellow road warrior. The interior of Murphy's Last Stop was a time capsule from a bygone era, with wood-paneled walls, vinyl booths that had seen better decades, and a jukebox that probably still played 45 RPM records. The fluorescent lights hummed and flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look pale and sickly. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, the kind of person who'd spent too many years working the night shift in places like this. The other trucker was standing at the coffee station, filling a large styrofoam cup with what looked like motor oil. Tommy approached and nodded in greeting, following the unwritten code of the road that said truckers should acknowledge each other, even if they were strangers. "Long night?" Tommy asked, reaching for his own cup. The other driver looked up and smiled, but something about his expression made Tommy's skin crawl. The man's eyes were too bright, too intense, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed too white and too sharp. When he spoke, his voice had a quality that reminded Tommy of fingernails on a chalkboard. "Every night's a long night out here," the man replied. "But I don't mind. I enjoy the solitude, the darkness. It gives me time to think about my work." There was something in the way he said work that made Tommy uncomfortable, as if the word carried implications that went far beyond simple freight hauling. The man extended his hand in greeting, and Tommy noticed that his fingers were unusually long and pale, with nails that looked more like claws. "Name's Carl," the stranger said. "Carl Wickham. I've been driving these roads for more years than I care to count." Tommy shook the offered hand and immediately regretted it. Carl's skin was ice cold, despite the warm interior of the truck stop, and his grip was uncomfortably strong. More disturbing was the texture. The man's palm felt rough and scaly, like the hide of some reptilian creature. "Tommy Morrison," he replied, pulling his hand back as quickly as politeness would allow. "I'm heading up to Salt Lake. You?" Carl's smile widened, revealing even more of those unnaturally sharp teeth. "Oh, I go wherever the road takes me. I'm not particular about destinations. It's the journey that matters, don't you think? The people you meet along the way." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Tommy found himself growing increasingly uneasy. Carl spoke in riddles and half-statements, always seeming to imply more than he actually said. He mentioned having cargo that required special handling and talked about making deliveries to people who were very particular about their requirements. When Tommy asked what kind of freight Carl hauled, the man's eyes took on a predatory gleam. "Let's just say I transport things that most people wouldn't want to know about. Specialized items for specialized clients. The kind of work that pays very well if you have the stomach for it." Tommy excused himself and walked to the counter to pay for his coffee, but he could feel Carl's eyes following him across the room. The cashier, whose name tag identified her as Dolores, rang up his purchase with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd performed the same task thousands of times. "You be careful out there, honey," Dolores said quietly, glancing toward Carl. "That one's been coming in here for months, always alone, always asking questions about other drivers. Something ain't right about him." Tommy nodded and headed for the door, but Carl intercepted him near the exit. "Hey, Tommy, I was thinking, we're both heading north and the road can get pretty lonely. Why don't we convoy for a while? Keep each other company on the CB." Every instinct Tommy possessed was screaming at him to refuse, but he didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. "Sure, I guess that would be okay. I'm on Channel 19. Carl's smile became even more unsettling. "Perfect. I'll be right behind you, watching your back. You never know what kind of dangers you might encounter out there in the dark." Tommy left the truck stop with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. As he performed his pre-trip inspection, he noticed Carl watching him from across the parking lot, standing motionless beside his Peterbilt like a scarecrow. The man's truck looked normal enough from a distance, but there was something about it that seemed wrong. The proportions were slightly off, and the chrome seemed to gleam with an unnatural brightness in the artificial light. Tommy climbed into his cab and started his engine, eager to get back on the road and put some distance between himself and the strange trucker. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, He saw Carl's headlights appear in his mirrors, following at a distance that was close enough to be threatening but far enough away to seem coincidental. The CB radio crackled to life as Tommy merged onto the highway. "Hey there, Tommy boy. This is your new road buddy, Carl. Beautiful night for driving, isn't it? So peaceful, so quiet. Perfect for getting to know each other better." Tommy keyed his microphone reluctantly. "Yeah, it's a nice night. Good visibility, light traffic." "Oh, I love light traffic," Carl's voice replied, carrying an undertone that made Tommy's blood run cold. Fewer witnesses, fewer complications. Just two truckers alone on the highway, sharing stories and experiences. The conversation continued for the next hour, with Carl asking increasingly personal questions about Tommy's family, his home address, his usual routes and schedules. Tommy tried to keep his responses vague, but Carl was persistent, always probing for more details, more information that could be used for unknown purposes. "You know, Tommy, I've been thinking about expanding my business operations. I'm always looking for new partners, people who understand the value of discretion. The kind of work I do requires a special type of person. Someone who can keep secrets. Someone who won't ask too many questions about the cargo." Tommy's unease was growing by the mile. "What exactly do you haul, Carl? You keep talking about specialized cargo, but you never say what it is." Carl's laughter came through the radio like the sound of breaking glass. "Let's just say I transport items that are very much in demand, but difficult to obtain through conventional channels. Rare specimens, you might say. Things that most people have never seen and hopefully never will." The highway stretched ahead through the Nevada desert, empty and desolate under a canopy of stars. Tommy realized that he was completely alone with this strange man, miles from the nearest town, with no cell phone coverage and no way to call for help if the situation went bad. Carl's truck continued to follow at the same distance, its headlights like predatory eyes in Tommy's mirrors. "You seem nervous, Tommy," Carl's voice observed. "Your driving's getting a little erratic. Maybe you should pull over and take a break. I know a perfect spot just ahead, very private, very secluded. We could have a face-to-face conversation, really get to know each other." Tommy's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm fine, thanks. I want to make some more miles before I stop." "Oh, but I insist," Carl replied. And now his voice had taken on a commanding tone that seemed to bypass Tommy's conscious mind and speak directly to his nervous system. "There's a rest area at mile marker 127. You're going to pull over there and we're going to have a little chat about your future." Despite every rational thought in his head telling him not to, Tommy found himself slowing down as he approached mile marker 127. There was indeed a rest area there. A small, poorly lit parking area with a few picnic tables and a restroom building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. His truck seemed to be steering itself toward the exit ramp, as if his hands were no longer under his own control. Tommy fought against the compulsion, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. With tremendous effort, he managed to keep his truck on the highway, but the struggle left him exhausted and shaking. Behind him, Carl's truck had moved closer, and Tommy could see that the other driver was no longer alone in his cab. There were figures moving around inside Carl's truck, shadowy shapes that didn't look entirely human. They seemed to be preparing something, arranging equipment or tools that Tommy couldn't identify, but instinctively knew he didn't want to see up close. "That wasn't very cooperative, Tommy," Carl's voice said. And now it sounded different, deeper, more resonant, as if it were coming from something much larger than a human throat. I was hoping we could do this the easy way, but you're going to make me work for it. I do so enjoy a challenge. Carl's truck suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside Tommy's rig in the left lane. Through the passenger window, Tommy could see Carl behind the wheel. But the man's appearance had changed dramatically. His skin had taken on a grayish, mottled appearance, and his eyes now glowed with an inner light that was definitely not human. Most disturbing of all, his mouth had stretched into an impossibly wide grin that revealed rows of shark-like teeth. The figures in Carl's passenger seat and sleeper compartment were now clearly visible, and Tommy's mind recoiled from what he was seeing. They weren't human at all, but something that might have been human once, before being transformed into something else entirely. Their bodies were elongated and twisted, with too many joints in their limbs and faces that looked like they'd been melted and reformed. One of the creatures pressed its face against Carl's passenger window and began licking the glass with a tongue that was far too long and covered in what looked like barbs. Its eyes locked onto Tommy's, and he could feel it trying to establish some kind of mental connection, probing at the edges of his consciousness with tendrils of alien thought. Tommy grabbed his CB microphone and began broadcasting on the emergency channel. Mayday, Mayday, this is eastbound I-80 at mile marker 130. I'm being pursued by hostile individuals. Request immediate assistance from any law enforcement in the area. The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. It was as if Carl and his companions were somehow jamming all communication frequencies, isolating Tommy from any potential help. Carl's truck began to crowd Tommy's rig, forcing him toward the shoulder of the highway. The creatures inside were becoming more agitated, pressing against the windows and making sounds that were part animal growl, part electronic interference. Tommy could see that they were holding instruments that looked like a cross between medical equipment and torture devices. "You can't run forever, Tommy," Carl's voice said, now coming through the radio with a quality that made the speakers vibrate and distort. "We know where you live, where your family lives. We know your roots, your schedules, your habits. You're going to stop eventually, and when you do, we'll be waiting." Tommy realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random encounter. Carl and his companions had been stalking him, studying his patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The meeting at Murphy's last stop hadn't been coincidental. It had been carefully orchestrated to get Tommy alone on this isolated stretch of highway. The creatures in Carl's truck were now working on something that looked like a large net or web, made from material that seemed to shift and writhe with its own internal movement. Tommy understood that they were preparing to capture him, to drag him into their vehicle where unspeakable things would be done to him. In desperation, Tommy began looking for any possible escape route. The highway was elevated here, running along a ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides. There were no exit ramps, no side roads. Nowhere to go except forward into whatever trap Carl had prepared for him. That's when Tommy remembered the runaway truck ramp he'd passed about 5 miles back. If he could somehow get Carl's truck to overshoot him, he might be able to double back and use the ramp to escape into the desert, where the creature's larger vehicle would have trouble following. Tommy suddenly hit his brakes, causing his truck to decelerate rapidly. Carl's truck shot past him, and Tommy could see the creatures inside scrambling to adjust their positions. He immediately floored the accelerator and began weaving back and forth across both lanes, making it difficult for Carl to match his movements. The chase continued for several more miles, with Carl's truck trying to box Tommy in while the creatures inside prepared their capture equipment. Tommy could see more of them now, at least 6 or 7 beings that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of different species. Some had too many arms. Others had heads that were the wrong shape for their bodies. And all of them moved with a fluid, boneless quality that suggested their anatomy was fundamentally different from anything terrestrial. Finally, Tommy saw what he'd been looking for: an emergency crossover in the highway median that would allow him to reverse direction. He waited until Carl's truck was committed to a passing maneuver, then suddenly cut across the median and began heading back the way he'd come. Carl's truck tried to follow, but its larger size and the presence of the creatures inside made it less maneuverable. Tommy watched in his mirrors as the vehicle skidded sideways across the median, nearly rolling over before coming to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. Tommy didn't stop to see if Carl and his companions were injured. He drove at maximum speed back toward Murphy's last stop, hoping to find help or at least other people who could witness what was happening. But when he arrived at the truck stop, he found it completely abandoned. The lights were off, the doors were locked, and there was no sign of Dolores or anyone else. It was as if the entire place had been evacuated in preparation for whatever Carl had planned to do to Tommy. The realization that the creatures had accomplices, that they were part of some larger organization, made Tommy's situation even more desperate. He continued driving east, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the site of the encounter. His CB radio remained silent, and his cell phone showed no signal, as if he'd been cut off from all communication with the outside world. It wasn't until Tommy reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City that his phone finally picked up a signal, and he was able to call 911. The dispatcher took his report seriously and promised to send patrol cars to investigate the area where the encounter had occurred. But Tommy knew they wouldn't find anything. Carl and his companions were too smart, too organized to leave evidence behind. They would have cleaned up any traces of their presence and moved on to stalk their next victim. The highway was full of isolated truckers who could disappear without anyone noticing for days or weeks. Tommy completed his delivery in Salt Lake City, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He started varying his routes, avoiding the Nevada desert entirely and carrying more weapons in his truck. He also began researching similar incidents and found a disturbing pattern of missing truckers along remote highways throughout the western United States. The creatures were real, and they were using the trucking industry's vast network to hunt for victims. They understood the culture of the road well enough to blend in, to appear normal until they revealed their true nature. Most drivers who encountered them probably never lived to tell about it. Tommy started sharing his story with other truckers, warning them about the dangers of accepting convoy invitations from strangers, especially on isolated highways. Some listened, but most dismissed his warnings as the product of too many hours on the road and too much caffeine. But Tommy knew the truth, and he carried that knowledge with him every time he climbed into his cab and headed out onto the highway. Somewhere in the darkness between cities, Carl and his companions were still hunting, still searching for their next victim. The road was full of predators that no safety manual could prepare you for, and the most dangerous ones were the ones that looked almost human until it was too late to escape. And in the deepest part of the Nevada desert, Murphy's last stop sits empty and abandoned, waiting for the next unsuspecting trucker to stop for fuel and coffee, unaware that they're walking into a trap that's been carefully prepared by things that should not exist. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the hunters that prowl its endless miles, wearing human faces like masks while they search for their next prey. Let's move to our 7th story. The shoulder of Interstate 75 stretched endlessly through the Georgia pines as Marcus pulled his Mack truck to a stop. the diesel engine's rumble fading into the humid night air. It was 2:15 a.m. on a sweltering August evening, and the heat hadn't broken even after sunset. The asphalt still radiated warmth from the day's brutal sun, creating shimmering mirages that danced in his headlights like ghostly apparitions. Marcus had been driving for 19 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across the southeastern United States. He knew every truck stop, every way station, and every dangerous curve between Atlanta and Miami. But tonight, something had forced him to pull over. Not mechanical trouble or fatigue, but something far more unsettling that he couldn't quite name. For the past 50 miles, Marcus had been seeing figures walking along the highway shoulder. At first, he dismissed them as hitchhikers or stranded motorists. But as the sightings became more frequent, he began to notice disturbing patterns that defied logical explanation. The figures all walked in the same direction, moving north against the flow of traffic with a purposeful, measured gait that never varied. They appeared to be people of all ages. Elderly men in hospital gowns, middle-aged women in blue dresses, children in pajamas, teenagers in school uniforms. But they all shared certain characteristics that made Marcus's skin crawl. None of them ever looked at approaching vehicles or attempted to flag down help. They walked with their heads held high, staring straight ahead with expressions of serene contentment that seemed completely inappropriate for people wandering a dangerous highway in the middle of the night. Most disturbing of all, they cast no shadows, despite the bright illumination from Marcus's headlights. Marcus had encountered his first shoulder walker about an hour earlier, an elderly woman in a faded hospital gown, shuffling along the gravel shoulder near Valdosta. She reminded him of his late grandmother, and his first instinct had been to stop and offer assistance. But something about the woman's posture and movement had triggered his survival instincts, warning him that this wasn't a normal situation. As he'd slowed his truck and pulled toward the shoulder, the woman had turned to look directly at him. Her face was pale and waxy, with eyes that reflected his headlights like an animal's. She'd smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect, and raised one bony hand in what might have been a greeting or a summons. Marcus had accelerated past her, his heart pounding with inexplicable terror. In his mirrors, he'd watched the woman return to her measured walk, as if the encounter had never happened. But the image of her face, that terrible knowing smile, was burned into his memory. Since then, Marcus had counted at least 24 more shoulder walkers, all moving north with the same purposeful stride, all wearing that same serene expression. They appeared at regular intervals, roughly every 2 or 3 miles, as if they were following some predetermined route or responding to a signal that only they could perceive. Now, parked on the shoulder with his hazard lights flashing, Marcus tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. He grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19, hoping to contact other truckers who might have seen the same phenomenon. Breaker 19, this is southbound I-75 at mile marker 42. Anyone else seeing pedestrians on the shoulder tonight? Over. The radio crackled with static for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. Yeah, I copy that, driver. Been seeing them for the past 100 miles. Strangest damn thing I ever witnessed. They just keep walking, don't matter what the weather or traffic conditions are. Another voice joined the conversation. This is northbound at marker 67. I've been tracking these people for 2 hours now. Counted over 40 so far, all heading the same direction. tried to stop and help one of them. Little girl in a nightgown. But she just looked right through me like I wasn't there. Marcus keyed his microphone. Anyone know where they're going or where they're coming from? Negative on that, good buddy. But I'll tell you what's really got me spooked. I passed the same old man 3 times tonight. Same clothes, same walk, same everything. Either there's a whole bunch of identical people out here, or something ain't right with what we're seeing. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with truckers sharing increasingly disturbing observations about the shoulder walkers. Some reported seeing the same individuals multiple times over the course of hours or even days. Others described encounters where the walkers had suddenly appeared directly in front of their trucks, forcing emergency stops, only to vanish moments later. One driver claimed to have followed a group of shoulder walkers to their apparent destination, an abandoned rest area that had been closed for renovations. According to his account, the walkers had simply walked into the darkened building and disappeared, as if the walls were permeable to their passage. Marcus decided to conduct his own investigation. He'd always been curious by nature, and the mystery of the shoulder walkers was too compelling to ignore. He started his engine and began driving slowly northward, keeping his eyes peeled for the next figure. He didn't have to wait long. About 5 miles up the road, his headlights illuminated a man in his 40s wearing a business suit that looked like it had been expensive once, but was now stained and torn. The man walked with the same measured pace as the others, his briefcase swinging rhythmically at his side. Marcus pulled alongside the walking figure and rolled down his passenger window. "Hey, buddy. You need a ride? It's not safe to be walking out here." The man turned to look at Marcus, and the trucker immediately regretted his decision to stop. The figure's face was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. His mouth was set in a slight smile that never wavered, and his eyes held an emptiness that suggested no one was home behind them. "Thank you for your concern," the man said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "But I have somewhere I need to be. We all do." "Where are you going?" Marcus asked, though every instinct was telling him to drive away as fast as possible. The man's smile widened slightly. "North, always north. To the place where the walking ends and the real work begins." Marcus felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. "What kind of work?" "The kind that requires fresh volunteers," the man replied. And now his voice carried an undertone that made Marcus's teeth ache. "People like you, who stop to help strangers in the night. People who ask too many questions." The man's eyes began to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light, and Marcus could see that his pupils had elongated into vertical slits like a reptile's. The businessman's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. Marcus floored the accelerator, his truck lurching forward as he fled from the encounter. In his mirrors, he could see the man standing motionless on the shoulder, watching him drive away with those terrible, glowing eyes. But as the distance increased, Marcus realized with growing horror that the figure was somehow keeping pace with his truck, moving without appearing to walk or run. The CB radio crackled to life, with a voice that Marcus recognized as the businessman's, though he was now several miles away. "You can't outrun us, Marcus. We know your name, your route, your destination. We've been watching you for a long time, waiting for the right moment to extend our invitation." Marcus grabbed his microphone with shaking hands. "How do you know my name? What do you want from me?" "We want you to join us, Marcus, to become part of something larger than yourself. The walking is just the beginning, a way to sort out those who are ready from those who who aren't. You've shown curiosity, compassion, the willingness to help strangers. These are valuable qualities in our line of work. What line of work? Marcus demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Recruitment, the voice replied. We're always looking for new team members, people who understand the importance of helping others find their true purpose. The shoulder is just our interview process, a way to identify candidates who have the right disposition. Marcus realized with dawning horror that the shoulder walkers weren't victims or lost souls. They were recruiters, agents of some larger organization that used the highway system to identify and collect potential members. The walking was a form of psychological testing, designed to attract people who would stop to help strangers in distress. What happens to people who join you? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. They find peace, the voice replied. No more worries about deadlines, fuel costs, or mechanical breakdowns. No more loneliness on the long hauls. Just the satisfaction of meaningful work and the companionship of like-minded individuals. Marcus looked in his mirrors and saw that the shoulder walkers were now appearing in greater numbers, emerging from the tree line on both sides of the highway. They moved with increasing coordination, forming loose groups that seemed to be herding his truck toward some predetermined destination. The businessman's voice returned, now coming from multiple radio channels simultaneously. You're approaching the collection point, Marcus. Don't be afraid. The transition is quite painless. Most people find it rather liberating, actually. No more decisions to make, no more responsibilities to worry about. Ahead of Marcus, the highway curved to the right, and he could see lights in the distance that didn't look like normal traffic. As he got closer, he realized it was a massive gathering of shoulder walkers. Hundreds of figures standing in perfect formation across both lanes of the interstate, blocking all traffic in both directions. They stood with military precision, arranged in rows that stretched from the median to the outer shoulders. All of them were facing Marcus's approaching truck, and all of them wore the same serene smile that he'd seen on the businessman's face. Their eyes glowed with that same phosphorescent light, creating a constellation of unblinking stars in the darkness. Marcus hit his brakes and brought his truck to a stop about 50 yards from the assembled crowd. He could see other vehicles scattered among the walkers, cars, trucks, and motorcycles that had apparently been stopped by previous gatherings. Some of the vehicles' drivers were now standing among the walkers, having apparently joined their ranks. The businessman appeared at Marcus's driver's side window, though Marcus hadn't seen him approach. Up close, the figure's inhuman nature was even more apparent. His skin had a translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath the surface, and his movements were too fluid, too graceful for normal human anatomy. Welcome to the end of your journey, Marcus, the businessman said, and the beginning of your real purpose. Step out of the truck and let us show you what you've been missing all these years on the road. Marcus looked at the assembled crowd and realized that many of the faces were familiar. Truckers he'd known for years, drivers who had simply vanished from the CB channels without explanation. They all wore the same peaceful expression, the same empty smile that suggested they'd found something they'd been searching for their entire lives. The temptation was overwhelming. Marcus was tired of the loneliness, tired of the endless miles and the constant pressure to make deliveries on time. The idea of joining a community where all of those worries would disappear was incredibly appealing. But something deep in his core rebelled against the offer. Marcus had always been independent, always valued his freedom above security or comfort. The thought of surrendering his will to some collective consciousness, no matter how peaceful it might be, filled him with revulsion. Instead of opening his door, Marcus threw his truck into reverse and began backing away from the gathering. The shoulder walkers immediately began moving toward him, their serene expressions never changing, but their pace increasing dramatically. They moved with inhuman speed and coordination, flowing around obstacles like water while maintaining their formation. Marcus spun his truck around in a dangerous U-turn and began driving south, back the way he'd come. In his mirrors, he could see the entire gathering pursuing him, moving as a single organism across the highway. They didn't run or walk. They simply flowed forward with a speed that defied physics, gaining ground despite his truck's acceleration. The chase continued for miles, with the shoulder walkers maintaining their pursuit while the businessman's voice provided commentary through the CB radio. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Marcus. We have agents throughout the highway system, every truck stop, every way station, every rest area. You can't drive forever, and when you stop, we'll be waiting." Marcus realized that the businessman was right. He couldn't outrun an organization that had infiltrated the entire trucking infrastructure. But he also knew that he couldn't surrender to them, couldn't allow himself to become another empty-eyed recruit in their endless army. As dawn began to break over the Georgia landscape, the shoulder walkers gradually fell behind and disappeared, as if daylight somehow weakened their ability to maintain the pursuit. Marcus continued driving south until he reached the Florida border, where he finally felt safe enough to stop and call for help. But when he tried to report the incident to the authorities, he found that no one would believe his story. The Georgia State Police had no record of any unusual activity on the 75, and the trucking company's dispatcher insisted that all drivers in their fleet were accounted for and operating normally. Marcus realized that the shoulder walkers organization was far more sophisticated than he'd imagined, with the ability to cover up their activities and manipulate official records. They operated in the shadows of the transportation industry, using the anonymity and isolation of long-haul trucking to conduct their recruitment operations. From that night forward, Marcus never drove alone on isolated highways after dark. He started traveling in convoys with other truckers, and he always carried multiple forms of communication in case his CB radio was compromised. Most importantly, he never stopped to help strangers walking along the highway shoulder, no matter how much his conscience urged him to do so. Because Marcus had learned that sometimes the people who appear to need help the most are actually the ones you should fear the most. The shoulder walkers were still out there, still recruiting, still adding to their ranks one compassionate driver at a time. And somewhere on a dark highway in Georgia, they continue their endless march northward, searching for the next trucker who will make the fatal mistake of stopping to offer assistance to a stranger in the night. The road is full of predators that wear the faces of victims, and the most dangerous ones are the ones that appeal to our better angels, while leading us towards something far worse than death. Let's move to our 8th story. The banging started at exactly 2:47 a.m., jolting Derek awake in his sleeper compartment like a gunshot in the Pennsylvania darkness. 3 thunderous impacts against the right side of his Kenworth, each one powerful enough to rock the entire 40-ton rig on its suspension. Derek's first thought was that another truck had sideswiped him. But as he sat up in his bunk and listened to the silence that followed, he realized something far stranger was happening. Derek had been parked at this rest area for less than 2 hours, catching his mandatory 8-hour break before continuing his run from Pittsburgh to Boston. The lot was nearly empty, except for 2 other big rigs, parked about 100 yards ahead of him. A red Freightliner and a white Volvo, both with their running lights glowing like sleeping giants in the pre-dawn darkness. The rest area itself was one of those forgotten places that Pennsylvania's Department of Transportation had built in the 1970s and barely maintained since. Cracked picnic tables sat scattered around a small building that housed restrooms so filthy that most truckers preferred to use the woods. A single flickering streetlight cast weak yellow light across the crumbling asphalt, creating shadows that seemed to move and shift with each flicker of the dying bulb. Derek grabbed his flashlight and peered out his passenger window, expecting to see damage from whatever had struck his truck. But the side of his trailer looked perfectly normal. No dents, no scratches, no sign that anything had made contact with the metal. He checked his driver's side mirror and saw nothing unusual, just empty parking spaces and the dark tree line that bordered the rest area. The banging came again, this time from the left side of his truck. 3 more impacts, perfectly spaced and delivered with tremendous force. The entire cab shook, and Derek could hear his coffee mug rattling in its holder. But when he looked out his driver's window, he saw nothing that could have caused the noise. Derek had been trucking for 12 years, and he'd experienced everything from blown tires to engine fires. But this was something entirely different, something that defied logical explanation. The impacts were too powerful and too precise to be caused by wind or settling metal, and there was no one visible outside his truck who could be responsible. He grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19, hoping to contact the other drivers in the lot. Breaker 19, this is the Kenworth in the back of the rest area. Anyone else hearing loud banging noises? Over. The radio crackled with static for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. Yeah, I copy that, driver. Been hearing it for the past 10 minutes. Something's pounding on all our trucks, but I can't see what's doing it. A second voice joined the conversation, younger and more nervous. This is the white Volvo. Whatever it is, it's moving between our rigs. I saw something dark pass by my windshield, but it was too fast to make out what it was. Derek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool Pennsylvania night. Anyone got eyes on what we're dealing with here? Negative, the first voice replied. But I'll tell you what, I've been driving for 23 years, and I ain't never experienced nothing like this. It's like something's testing our trucks, checking to see if we're awake. The banging resumed, this time striking all 3 trucks simultaneously. Derek could hear the impacts echoing across the rest area as whatever was out there attacked each vehicle with the same methodical precision. The sound was deafening, like someone swinging a sledgehammer against sheet metal. But there was a rhythm to it that suggested intelligence rather than random violence. Derek decided to investigate. He pulled on his boots and grabbed his baseball bat from behind his seat, then quietly opened his door and stepped out into the night. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of diesel exhaust, and he could hear the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. But the rest area itself was eerily quiet, as if whatever had been making the noise had suddenly stopped. He walked around his truck, playing his flashlight beam across every surface, looking for signs of damage or clues about what had been striking his rig. The metal was unmarked, but Derek noticed something that made his skin crawl. There were handprints on the side of his trailer, dozens of them, pressed into the metal as if the aluminum had been soft clay. The prints were human in shape, but wrong in size and proportion. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and they were arranged in patterns that suggested the creature responsible had far more than the normal number of hands. Some of the prints overlapped others, creating a chaotic collage of alien anatomy pressed into the metal surface. Derek's flashlight beam swept across the ground around his truck, and he saw more evidence of the mysterious visitor. Footprints in the dirt showed a bipedal creature with feet that were at least 18 inches long and equipped with what looked like claws instead of toes. The stride length between prints was nearly 6 feet, suggesting something that was either very tall or capable of moving with inhuman speed. The CB radio in his truck crackled to life with the nervous voice of the Volvo driver. "Hey, guys, I think I see it. There's something moving between the trees at the edge of the lot. It's big, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and it's watching us." Derek turned his flashlight toward the tree line and saw a pair of eyes reflecting the beam back at him. They were positioned too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they had an intelligence behind them that was unmistakably aware and calculating. As Derek watched, the eyes moved laterally through the trees, circling the rest area like a predator studying its prey. "I see it too," Derek called into his radio. "Whatever it is, it's been checking out our trucks. There are handprints all over my trailer, and the footprints suggest something that ain't natural." The older driver's voice came through the radio with a tone of grim experience. "Boys, I think we need to get out of here. I've heard stories about things that hunt truckers at remote rest areas, and this fits the pattern. They test your defenses first, see if you're awake and alert, then they make their move." Derek was about to respond when the banging resumed with renewed intensity. But this time, it wasn't random impacts. The creature was pounding out a rhythm, a complex pattern that sounded almost like communication. The beats echoed off the surrounding trees and seemed to be answered by similar sounds from deeper in the forest. "There's more than one of them," Derek realized with growing horror. "They're talking to each other." The eyes in the tree line multiplied, becoming a constellation of reflected light that surrounded the rest area. Derek counted at least a dozen pairs, all positioned at the same unnatural height, all focused on the 3 trucks with predatory intensity. The creatures were coordinating their approach, using the darkness and their superior numbers to their advantage. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that was far more terrifying: the scraping of claws against metal as the creatures began climbing onto the trucks. Derek could hear them moving across the roofs of the trailers, their weight causing the suspension to creak and groan. They moved with surprising stealth for such large beings, their clawed feet finding purchase on the smooth metal surfaces. Derek ran back to his cab and climbed inside, locking the doors behind him. Through his windshield, he could see dark shapes moving across the other trucks, silhouetted against the weak glow of the streetlight. The creatures were humanoid in general shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in ways that human joints couldn't accommodate. One of the creatures dropped down from the roof of the Freightliner and landed directly in front of Derek's truck. In the harsh glare of his headlights, he got his first clear look at what they were dealing with. The thing stood nearly 9 feet tall, with gray mottled skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. Its arms were disproportionately long, reaching almost to the ground, and ended in hands that had too many fingers, each tipped with claws that gleamed like polished bone. The creature's face was the most disturbing feature, vaguely human in structure, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Its eyes were large and completely black, with no visible pupils or irises, and its mouth was filled with teeth that looked more suited to tearing meat than any kind of normal diet. The thing tilted its head as it studied Derek's truck, moving with the curious intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. It approached the driver's side door and began tapping on the window with one elongated finger. The sound sharp and rhythmic, like Morse code. Derek grabbed his CB microphone with shaking hands. "They're right outside our trucks. I can see one of them clearly, and it's not human. We need to get out of here now." "Agreed," the Freightliner driver replied. "On my count, we all start our engines and get the hell out of here. 3, 2, 1, go." Derek turned his key and felt a surge of relief as his diesel engine roared to life. But his relief was short-lived. The creature at his door didn't flee from the noise. Instead, it began pounding on his window with increasing intensity, its claws leaving scratches in the safety glass. Derek threw his transmission into gear and began moving forward. But the creature kept pace with his truck, running alongside the cab with inhuman speed and agility. More of the beings emerged from the trees and began pursuing the 3 trucks as they fled the rest area, their long legs covering ground with loping strides that reminded Derek of wolves chasing prey. The chase continued onto the interstate, with the creatures maintaining their pursuit despite the truck's increasing speed. They ran in formation, communicating with each other through a series of clicks and whistles that carried over the noise of the diesel engines. Some of them attempted to leap onto the moving trucks, their claws scraping against metal as they tried to find purchase on the smooth surfaces. Derek pushed his truck to its maximum speed, the engine temperature gauge climbing dangerously high as he demanded more power than the machine was designed to deliver. In his mirrors, he could see the creatures falling behind, their endurance finally reaching its limits. But he didn't slow down until he reached the next truck stop, a brightly lit facility with plenty of other vehicles and people around. The 3 drivers met in the truck stop's restaurant, comparing their experiences and trying to make sense of what they'd encountered. All of their trucks showed evidence of the attack: handprints, claw marks, and dents from the creature's attempts to break in. But when they tried to report the incident to the authorities, they found that no one would believe their story. The Pennsylvania State Police took their statements, but clearly considered the report to be the product of overactive imaginations and too much caffeine. The truck stop's security cameras had malfunctioned during the time period when the chase had occurred, leaving no visual evidence of the creature's existence. Derek never stopped at that rest area again, and he warned other truckers to avoid it whenever possible. But he knew that the creatures were still out there, still hunting, still testing the defenses of unsuspecting drivers who made the mistake of parking in isolated locations. The incident changed all 3 drivers in ways that were hard to articulate. They became more cautious, more aware of their surroundings, and less trusting of remote rest areas that seemed too quiet or too empty. They also developed a network of communication, sharing information about dangerous locations and unusual encounters with other truckers who were willing to listen. And because they had learned that the highway was home to predators that no safety manual could prepare you for, creatures that used the darkness and isolation of the trucking life to hunt for victims. The banging in the night wasn't random. It was a test, a way for the creatures to determine which trucks contained alert, armed drivers and which ones held easy prey. And somewhere in the Pennsylvania darkness, at a forgotten rest area that most maps don't show, the creatures continue their nocturnal hunts, waiting for the next group of truckers who will make the fatal mistake of stopping for the night in the wrong place. The road never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt along its edges, testing our defenses and waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. Let's move to our 9th story. The GPS on Tony's dashboard showed nothing but empty highway for the next 60 miles, as he navigated his Peterbilt through the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. It was just past midnight on a frigid February night, and the snow was falling so heavily that his windshield wipers could barely keep up with the accumulation. The temperature gauge read -22 degrees, the kind of cold that could freeze diesel fuel and kill a man in minutes if his truck broke down in the wrong place. Tony had been hauling lumber from the mills around Coeur d'Alene for 8 years, and he knew these mountain roads better than most locals. The route through the Bitterroot Mountains was treacherous, even in good weather, with steep grades, hairpin turns, and drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet into rocky canyons. In conditions like tonight, it was borderline suicidal. But the construction company in Spokane needed the load by morning, and Tony couldn't afford to miss another deadline. The paranoia had started about 50 miles back, just after he'd passed through the last small town before entering the true wilderness. At first, it was just a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, the kind of unease that experienced drivers learn to trust. But as the miles accumulated and the snow continued to fall, the feeling had grown into a certainty that he was being watched, followed, hunted by something that moved through the forest alongside his truck. Tony had tried to dismiss the sensation as a product of fatigue and isolation, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. In his mirrors, he caught glimpses of movement between the trees, dark shapes that seemed to pace his truck, maintaining the same speed and direction despite the difficult terrain. When he slowed down, they slowed down. When he accelerated, they kept pace with inhuman endurance. The CB radio had been silent for hours, which wasn't unusual in this remote area where mountains blocked most transmissions. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive, as if something was actively jamming the frequencies to prevent him from calling for help. Tony's satellite phone showed no signal, and his cell phone had lost coverage miles ago, leaving him completely cut off from the outside world. The first direct sign of trouble came when Tony noticed tracks in the snow alongside the highway. They appeared in his headlights as he rounded a sharp curve, running parallel to the road in the soft powder that had accumulated on the shoulder. The tracks were large, easily twice the size of human footprints, and they showed a stride length that suggested something moving at incredible speed. But what made Tony's blood run cold was the realization that the tracks were fresh, made within the last few minutes based on how little snow had accumulated in them. Whatever was making them was not only keeping pace with his truck, but was close enough to leave evidence of its passage in the areas illuminated by his headlights. Tony pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck faster than was safe on the icy mountain road. The diesel engine roared as it climbed the steep grade, and he could feel the trailer sliding slightly on the curves despite his chains and experience. But the alternative, slowing down and allowing whatever was out there to get closer, seemed far more dangerous than the risk of losing control. The tracks multiplied as Tony continued climbing into the mountains. What had started as a single set of prints became 2, then 4, then too many to count. They crisscrossed the highway, disappeared into the forest, and reappeared on the other side, suggesting a pack of creatures that was coordinating their movements and surrounding his truck. Tony's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the frigid air. He'd heard stories from other drivers about encounters with strange creatures in remote areas, but he'd always dismissed them as tall tales or the products of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Now, faced with evidence that something was actively stalking him through the Idaho wilderness, those stories seemed far more credible. The attack came without warning as Tony navigated a particularly treacherous section of road that wound along the edge of a deep canyon. Something large struck the passenger side of his cab with tremendous force, rocking the entire truck and spiderwebbing the window. Tony fought to maintain control as his truck skidded toward the guardrail, the trailer jackknifing slightly before he managed to straighten it out. In the brief moment when whatever had attacked him was visible in his peripheral vision, Tony caught a glimpse of something that defied description. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in thick, dark fur that glistened with ice crystals. Its limbs were disproportionately long and muscular, and its face combined human and animal features in a way that suggested intelligence behind the predatory instincts. The creature landed in the snow beside the road and immediately began running alongside Tony's truck, its powerful legs carrying it effortlessly through the deep powder. It moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, covering ground with bounds that would have been impossible for any normal animal. More creatures emerged from the forest, appearing on both sides of the highway, like ghosts materializing from the swirling snow. They ran in formation, communicating with each other through howls and calls that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Tony counted at least 6 of them, all moving with the same supernatural speed and coordination. One of the creatures leapt onto Tony's trailer, its claws finding purchase on the metal surface despite the ice and snow. Tony could hear it moving across the roof, its weight causing the suspension to groan and the entire rig to sway dangerously. The sound of claws scraping against metal was audible, even over the roar of his diesel engine and the howling of the wind. Tony reached for his CB radio and began broadcasting on the emergency channel, hoping that someone, somewhere, might pick up his transmission. "Mayday, Mayday. This is northbound on Highway 95, mile marker unknown. I'm under attack by unknown hostiles. Request immediate assistance from any law enforcement in the area." The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. Tony was completely alone with whatever was happening outside his truck, cut off from help by the mountains and the storm. The creature on his trailer began working its way forward, moving with the confidence of something that had done this before. Tony could see its shadow in his mirrors as it approached the cab, and he realized with growing horror that it was trying to reach his fuel tanks. If it managed to puncture them, he would be stranded in the wilderness with no heat, no power, and no way to escape. In desperation, Tony began swerving back and forth across the highway, trying to shake the creature loose. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous on the icy road, and he could feel his trailer sliding toward the edge of the canyon with each turn. But the alternative, allowing the creature to disable his truck, seemed even more dangerous. The creature held on with inhuman strength, its claws leaving deep gouges in the metal as it fought to maintain its grip. Tony could hear it making sounds that were part growl, part human speech, as if it were trying to communicate with him or perhaps coordinate with the other members of its pack. That's when Tony noticed something that filled him with a new kind of terror. The creatures weren't just hunting him, they were herding him, forcing him toward a specific destination. Every time he tried to change direction or take an alternate route, they would appear to block his path, leaving him no choice but to continue on the road they wanted him to travel. The realization that this was a coordinated trap rather than a random attack made Tony's situation far more desperate. These creatures weren't just predators. They were intelligent, organized, and experienced in hunting vehicles on these mountain roads. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather patterns, and they knew exactly how to isolate and capture their prey. Tony pushed his truck to its absolute limits, the engine temperature gauge climbing dangerously high as he demanded more power than the machine was designed to deliver. The creature on his trailer was joined by another, and he could feel the additional weight affecting his truck's handling. The steering became sluggish, and the brakes felt spongy, as if the creature's presence was somehow interfering with his truck's mechanical systems. The pack began to close in, with creatures running alongside both sides of his truck and more visible in the forest ahead. They moved with perfect coordination, like a military unit executing a well-rehearsed operation. Tony realized that he was being driven toward an ambush point, a location where the creatures had prepared additional traps or obstacles. Just as Tony thought his situation couldn't get any worse, he crested a hill and saw what the creatures had been herding him toward. The highway ahead was blocked by a massive tree that had been deliberately felled across both lanes, its trunk positioned at the perfect height to stop a truck without completely destroying it. The creatures had been planning this trap, possibly for days or weeks, waiting for the right victim to come along. Tony had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. He could try to stop before hitting the tree, but that would leave him trapped and helpless while the creatures closed in. He could try to ram through the obstacle, but his truck probably wasn't powerful enough to move a tree of that size, and the impact would likely disable his vehicle. Instead, Tony chose a third option that was so dangerous it bordered on suicidal. He aimed his truck at the guardrail on the right side of the highway, hoping to break through and escape down the mountainside. It was a desperate gamble that would probably kill him, but it was better than being captured alive by whatever was hunting him. The impact with the guardrail was tremendous, sending shock waves through the entire truck and throwing Tony against his door with bone-jarring force. The metal barrier held for a moment, then gave way with a screech of twisted steel. Tony's truck plunged over the edge of the canyon, the trailer jackknifing as it followed the cab into the abyss. For several terrifying seconds, Tony was in free fall, his truck tumbling through space while he fought to maintain consciousness. The world spun around him in a kaleidoscope of snow, trees, and stars, and he was certain that he was about to die in the most violent way possible. But luck was with him that night. His truck crashed into a grove of pine trees about 30 feet below the highway, the branches and trunks absorbing much of the impact and preventing the vehicle from continuing its fall into the deeper parts of the canyon. Tony was thrown around the cab like a rag doll, but his seatbelt and the truck's safety features kept him from being killed outright. When the world finally stopped spinning, Tony found himself hanging upside down in his cab, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead and his entire body aching from the impact. His truck was wedged between several large trees, the cab tilted at a crazy angle but still intact. The engine had died in the crash, but the electrical system was still functioning, providing him with lights and heat. Tony managed to unbuckle his seatbelt and right himself, then began assessing his situation. His truck was totaled, his cargo was scattered across the mountainside, and he was stranded in a blizzard with no way to call for help. But he was alive, and for the moment, that was enough. Above him, Tony could hear the creatures moving along the edge of the canyon, their calls echoing through the forest as they searched for a way to reach him. They were persistent, but the terrain worked in his favor. The steep slope and dense trees made it difficult for them to descend to his location. Tony spent the rest of the night huddled in his cab, using his emergency supplies to stay warm while he waited for dawn. The creatures continued their vigil above, but as the hours passed, their calls became less frequent and more distant. By the time the sun rose over the Idaho mountains, they had disappeared entirely, leaving only tracks in the snow as evidence of their existence. Rescue came 12 hours later when a search helicopter spotted the wreckage of Tony's truck. The official report blamed the accident on weather conditions and driver fatigue, and no mention was made of the creatures that had forced him off the road. Tony's account of the attack was dismissed as a hallucination brought on by trauma and hypothermia. But Tony knew what he had experienced, and he carried that knowledge with him when he eventually returned to trucking. He never drove the Idaho mountain roads again, choosing instead to take longer routes that kept him on busier highways with more traffic and better communication coverage. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, still using the isolation of America's remote highways to trap unsuspecting drivers. They were intelligent, organized, and patient, capable of planning complex operations that could take weeks to execute. Most importantly, they understood human psychology well enough to exploit our predictable responses to danger. Tony started sharing his story with other truckers, warning them about the dangers of driving alone through remote wilderness areas, especially during severe weather when help was far away. Some listened, but most dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a man who'd spent too much time on the road. But the smart ones, the experienced drivers who'd learned to trust their instincts, began avoiding certain routes and traveling in convoys when they had to venture into isolated areas. They understood that the highway was home to predators that no safety manual could prepare you for. Creatures that used the vastness of the American wilderness to hunt for prey. And somewhere in the Idaho mountains, in a canyon where the snow never completely melts, the wreckage of Tony's truck still rests among the pine trees, a monument to the night when a driver's quick thinking and desperate courage allowed him to escape from something that should not exist. The wilderness never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt in its deepest, darkest corners, waiting for the next traveler who will venture too far from the safety of civilization. Let's move to our 10th story. The headlights of Ray's Kenworth cut through the darkness as he navigated the winding back roads of rural Alabama, his trailer loaded with automotive parts, bound for a factory in Montgomery. It was 3:30 a.m. on a humid September night, and the air was thick with the smell of kudzu and pine sap that drifted through his slightly open window. Ray had been driving these southern routes for 16 years, and he knew every truck stop, every speed trap, and every shortcut between Birmingham and the Gulf Coast. But tonight, Ray wasn't taking his usual route. A massive pileup on I-65 had closed the interstate for hours, forcing him and dozens of other truckers onto the secondary highways that snaked through Alabama's rural heartland. The GPS on his dashboard showed a maze of county roads and state highways that would add 3 hours to his trip. But it was better than sitting in traffic until dawn. The detour had taken Ray through some of the most isolated parts of the state, past abandoned farmhouses and overgrown cotton fields that hadn't been worked in decades. The small towns he'd passed through were dark and silent, their main streets lined with boarded-up storefronts and rusted gas station signs that advertised prices from another era. It was the kind of landscape that time had forgotten, where cell phone towers were rare and the nearest help might be 50 miles away. Ray was about 20 miles outside of a town called Millerville when he saw the flashing lights ahead. At first, he thought it might be a police roadblock or an accident scene. But as he got closer, he realized it was an ambulance parked on the shoulder of the highway. The emergency vehicle's red and white strobes painted the surrounding trees in alternating colors, creating a surreal light show in the darkness. Ray slowed his truck and pulled alongside the ambulance, expecting to see paramedics working on an accident victim, or perhaps loading someone into the back of the vehicle. Instead, he saw a single EMT standing beside the open rear doors, waving frantically at his truck. The man appeared to be in his 30s, wearing the standard uniform of a rural emergency medical service, and his face was etched with what looked like genuine desperation. Ray rolled down his window and called out, "You need help? I can call for backup on my CB." The EMT jogged over to Ray's truck, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Thank God you stopped," he said, his voice carrying a thick Alabama accent. "I've got a critical patient in the back, but my engine died and my radio's not working. I need to get this guy to the hospital in Montgomery, but it's 40 miles from here." Ray looked at the ambulance and noticed that it was an older model, probably from the 1990s, with rust spots around the wheel wells and a paint job that had seen better days. Rural emergency services often operated on shoestring budgets, so the vehicle's condition wasn't necessarily suspicious. But something about the situation made Ray's instincts prickle with unease. "What's wrong with your patient?" Ray asked, trying to get a better look at the interior of the ambulance. "Car accident about 10 miles back," the EMT replied. "Single vehicle, rolled over in a ditch. Driver's got internal bleeding and possible spinal injuries. I managed to stabilize him, but he needs surgery within the hour or he's not going to make it." Ray could see a figure lying on a gurney inside the ambulance, covered with a white sheet up to the neck. The patient appeared to be unconscious, and Ray could make out what looked like medical equipment surrounding the gurney. Everything seemed legitimate, but something about the EMT's demeanor was setting off alarm bells in Ray's subconscious. "Why don't you call for another ambulance?" Ray suggested. "Surely there's backup available." The EMT shook his head. "Closest unit is over an hour away, and this guy doesn't have that kind of time. Look, I know it's an unusual request, but could you give us a ride? Your truck's big enough to carry the gurney and the trailer, and I can monitor the patient during transport." Ray hesitated. His trailer was loaded with automotive parts, leaving no room for a gurney, and he wasn't sure his insurance would cover transporting medical patients. More importantly, something about the EMT's story didn't add up. If there had been a serious accident 10 miles back, why hadn't Ray seen any evidence of it? No skid marks, no debris, no other emergency vehicles responding to the scene. "I don't think that's going to work," Ray said carefully. "My trailer's full, and I'm not equipped for medical transport. Why don't I call ahead to Montgomery and have them send another ambulance to meet you halfway?" The EMT's expression changed subtly, and Ray caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating behind the man's eyes. "That's not going to work either," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This patient needs immediate transport, and you're the only option available." Ray's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol he kept in his door panel. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I'll call for backup on my CB and—" "You're going to help us," the EMT interrupted, and now his voice carried an authority that seemed to bypass Ray's conscious mind and speak directly to his nervous system. "You're going to pull your truck over to that rest area up ahead, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do." Ray felt a strange compulsion to comply, as if his hands were no longer under his own control. He found himself slowing the truck and looking for the rest area the EMT had mentioned, even though every rational thought in his head was screaming at him to drive away as fast as possible. The rest area turned out to be nothing more than a dirt pull-off with a few picnic tables and an outhouse that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Ray pulled his truck into the small lot, his movements feeling mechanical and disconnected from his will. The EMT followed in the ambulance, parking close enough to Ray's truck that escape would be difficult. As soon as Ray shut off his engine, the compulsion broke, and he regained control of his actions. He immediately reached for his CB radio, but found that it was producing nothing but static. His cell phone showed no signal, and his satellite emergency beacon wasn't responding to his attempts to activate it. The EMT appeared at Ray's driver's side window, no longer bothering to maintain his helpful facade. "Get out of the truck," he commanded, and Ray could see that the man's eyes had taken on an unnatural gleam in the darkness. "What do you want?" Ray asked, his hand gripping his pistol but not yet drawing it. "We want you to join our patient," the EMT replied with a smile that revealed teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. "He's been asking for company, and we think you'd be perfect for the role." Ray looked toward the ambulance and saw that the rear doors were now open, revealing the interior in all its horrifying detail. What he had mistaken for medical equipment was actually a collection of restraints, surgical instruments, and monitoring devices that looked more suited to torture than treatment. The figure on the gurney was indeed a patient, but not the kind Ray had expected. The man strapped to the gurney was conscious and aware, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the leather restraints that held him in place. His body was covered with surgical incisions that had been made with clinical precision, and tubes and wires ran from various wounds to machines that hummed and beeped with electronic life. "He's been with us for 3 days now," the EMT explained conversationally. "We've learned so much from him about human physiology, about pain tolerance, about the limits of consciousness. But he's starting to wear out, and we need fresh material for our research." Ray drew his pistol and pointed it at the EMT, but the man didn't seem concerned by the weapon. "Research into what?" Ray demanded. "The intersection of medicine and suffering," the EMT replied. "We're exploring the boundaries between life and death, between healing and harm. It's fascinating work, really. Most people don't appreciate the artistry involved in keeping someone alive while systematically dismantling their body." More figures emerged from the ambulance, all wearing medical uniforms, but moving with a coordination that suggested they weren't entirely human. They carried instruments that looked like a cross between surgical tools and medieval torture devices, and their faces held expressions of clinical detachment that were somehow more terrifying than outright malice. Ray realized that he had stumbled into the territory of something that used the cover of emergency medical services to hunt for victims. The ambulance was their mobile laboratory, allowing them to conduct their experiments while moving from location to location to avoid detection. "You're not EMTs," Ray said, backing toward his truck while keeping his weapon trained on the group. "Oh, but we are," the leader replied. "We're just not the kind that saves lives. We're the kind that studies them, that explores the full range of human experience from birth to death and everything in between." Ray climbed back into his truck and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened when he turned the key. The electrical system was completely dead, as if something had drained all power from his vehicle. Through his windshield, he could see the fake EMTs approaching with their instruments, moving with the patient confidence of predators who had done this many times before. In desperation, Ray kicked out his passenger window and climbed through the opening, dropping to the ground on the far side of his truck. He could hear the creatures moving around the vehicle, searching for him with the methodical efficiency of experienced hunters. Ray ran toward the tree line, hoping to lose himself in the Alabama woods until dawn brought the possibility of rescue. Behind him, he could hear the fake EMTs coordinating their search, their voices carrying an inhuman quality that suggested they weren't using normal vocal cords to communicate. The forest was dense and dark, filled with the sounds of nocturnal creatures that seemed to fall silent as Ray crashed through the underbrush. He could hear his pursuers following, moving through the trees with a grace that suggested they were more at home in the wilderness than on the highways. Ray ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning and his legs aching from the unaccustomed exercise. Every shadow could hide one of the creatures. Every sound could signal their approach. He had no idea where he was going or how he would get back to civilization. But staying ahead of his pursuers was his only chance of survival. As dawn began to break through the canopy, Ray found himself at the edge of a small town that wasn't on any map he'd ever seen. The streets were empty, the houses looked abandoned, and there was no sign of normal human activity. But there was a gas station with a payphone, and Ray used his last quarters to call 911. The dispatcher who answered seemed confused by Ray's location and his story about fake EMTs with a mobile torture chamber. When the state police finally arrived, they found no trace of the ambulance or its occupants. Ray's truck was discovered at the rest area, but it started normally and showed no signs of the electrical problems he'd experienced. The official report listed the incident as a possible hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress, and no investigation was conducted into the existence of the fake medical team. Ray's account was filed away and forgotten, just another trucker's tall tale about strange encounters on remote highways. But Ray knew what he had experienced, and he carried that knowledge with him when he returned to trucking. He started avoiding rural routes whenever possible, sticking to major highways with better traffic and communication coverage. He also began carrying more weapons and emergency equipment, preparing for encounters that no safety manual could anticipate. The fake EMTs were still out there, still using their mobile laboratory to conduct their horrific experiments on unsuspecting travelers. They understood human psychology well enough to exploit our instinct to help those in medical distress. And they used the authority of their uniforms to overcome their victims' natural caution. Ray started warning other truckers about the dangers of stopping for emergency vehicles in remote areas, especially when the situation seemed unusual or the personnel acted strangely. Some drivers listened, but most dismissed his warnings as paranoia or the product of too much time on isolated roads. But the smart ones, the experienced drivers who'd learned to trust their instincts, began questioning emergency situations more carefully and verifying the legitimacy of medical personnel before offering assistance. They understood that the highway was home to predators who wore the uniforms of those we're taught to trust and respect. And somewhere on the back roads of Alabama, an ambulance that isn't really an ambulance continues to prowl the darkness, searching for its next research subject. Inside its sterile interior, the tools of healing have been perverted into instruments of torture, and the oath to do no harm has been replaced with a dedication to exploring the darkest aspects of human suffering. The road never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt along its edges, wearing the faces of those who are supposed to help us in our darkest hours. Let's move to our 11th story. The brake pedal went straight to the floor without resistance, and Mike's heart stopped as he realized his worst nightmare was becoming reality. His fully loaded tanker truck, carrying 8,000 gallons of gasoline, was barreling down a steep mountain grade in Colorado with no way to stop. The speedometer climbed past 70 miles per hour as gravity pulled his 80,000-pound death machine toward the busy intersection at the bottom of the hill. Mike had been driving tanker trucks for 22 years, hauling everything from milk to hazardous chemicals across the western United States. He understood better than most people the devastating potential of his cargo. A single spark could turn his truck into a massive bomb capable of leveling city blocks and killing hundreds of innocent people. The responsibility of that knowledge weighed on him every day. But he'd never imagined facing a situation where his vehicle would become an uncontrolled weapon of mass destruction. The brake failure had happened without warning as Mike began his descent down Rabbit Ears Pass, a notoriously dangerous stretch of highway that dropped 2,000 feet in elevation over the course of 12 miles. He checked his brakes at the top of the grade, following standard safety protocols, and everything had seemed normal. But now, with his truck gaining speed on the steep incline, the brake pedal felt like it was connected to nothing. Mike's CB radio crackled to life as other truckers on the highway began to notice his erratic driving. "Hey, eastbound tanker, you're coming down that hill awful fast. Everything okay up there?" Mike grabbed his microphone with one hand while fighting to control his steering wheel with the other. "Negative? Good buddy. I've got total brake failure on a loaded fuel tanker. I'm doing 70 and climbing. Need immediate assistance clearing the road ahead." The response was immediate and coordinated. Within minutes, truckers throughout the area were broadcasting warnings and working with state police to clear traffic from Mike's path. The CB channels filled with voices offering advice, encouragement, and updates on road conditions ahead. But Mike knew that all the help in the world wouldn't change the fundamental physics of his situation. His truck was too heavy and moving too fast to be stopped by anything short of a catastrophic collision. The runaway truck ramps designed for situations like this were spaced too far apart, and he'd already passed the last one before his brakes failed. As his speed climbed past 80 miles per hour, Mike began considering options that no driver should ever have to contemplate. The highway ahead curved through a populated valley with schools, shopping centers, and residential neighborhoods. If he lost control in that area, the resulting explosion would kill dozens of people and destroy everything within a quarter-mile radius. Mike's radio crackled with the voice of another tanker driver who'd been following the situation. "Mike, this is Charlie in the blue Peterbilt. I've been hauling hazmat for 30 years, and I want you to know something. You're not alone up there. We're all with you, brother." The words brought tears to Mike's eyes, but they also strengthened his resolve. He realized that he had one option left, one way to prevent his truck from becoming a weapon of mass destruction. There was a steep embankment about 2 miles ahead, just before the highway entered the populated valley. If he could steer his truck off the road at that point, he might be able to crash in an unpopulated area where the explosion would harm no one but himself. "Charlie, I need you to call my wife," Mike said into his radio, his voice steady despite the terror he felt. "Tell her I love her, and tell my kids their daddy was thinking about them at the end." "Don't talk like that, Mike," Charlie replied. "We're going to figure this out. There's got to be another way." But Mike had already made his decision. He could see the embankment ahead, a steep slope that dropped into a rocky canyon, far from any buildings or people. It was his only chance to prevent a disaster that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. As Mike approached the chosen spot, he said a final prayer and yanked his steering wheel hard to the right. His truck left the highway at nearly 90 miles per hour, sailing through the air for a brief moment before crashing into the rocky slope with tremendous force. The explosion was visible for miles, a massive fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the Colorado sky. The blast was so powerful that it registered on seismographs at the Colorado School of Mines, and the smoke plume could be seen from Denver, 60 miles away. But Mike's sacrifice had worked. The explosion occurred in an uninhabited canyon, far from any people or structures. Emergency responders found a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep, but no other damage beyond the destroyed vegetation on the surrounding hillsides. Charlie and the other truckers who had been following the situation pulled over at the nearest truck stop. many of them too shaken to continue driving. They held an impromptu memorial service for Mike, sharing stories about his professionalism, his dedication to safety, and his ultimate sacrifice to protect innocent lives. The official investigation revealed that Mike's brake failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect in the brake line fittings, a problem that affected hundreds of trucks nationwide. The resulting recall prevented similar incidents, but it came too late to save Mike's life. Mike's story became legend among professional drivers, a reminder of the incredible responsibility that comes with hauling dangerous cargo and the heroism that ordinary people are capable of when faced with impossible choices. Trucking companies began using his example in safety training programs, teaching new drivers about the importance of equipment maintenance and the courage required to make the ultimate sacrifice. At the truck stop where Charlie and the other drivers had held their memorial, a small plaque was installed near the fuel pumps. It read simply, "In memory of Mike Thompson, who chose to save others rather than himself. The road is safer because of drivers like him." Mike's widow received letters from hundreds of people whose lives had been saved by her husband's decision. Parents whose children attended the school in the valley below. Shoppers who had been in the stores along his intended route. Families who lived in the neighborhoods that would have been destroyed by the explosion. The canyon where Mike crashed became an unofficial shrine for truckers. A place where drivers would stop to pay their respects and remember the man who had given everything to protect people he'd never met. Wildflowers now grow in the crater where his truck exploded, a natural memorial to a hero who made the hardest choice imaginable. Mike's story reminds us that heroism isn't always about dramatic rescues or battlefield courage. Sometimes it's about ordinary people making extraordinary sacrifices when faced with situations that test the very core of their character. Mike Thompson could have tried to save himself, could have hoped for a miracle that would allow him to survive. Instead, he chose to ensure that others would live, even though it meant his own death. The highway never forgets its heroes, and neither do the people whose lives they save. Mike's sacrifice echoes through every safety protocol, every brake inspection, and every moment when a driver chooses the welfare of others over their own survival. In the end, the most disturbing part of Mike's story isn't the mechanical failure or the explosive ending. It's the realization that there are people among us who possess the moral courage to make the ultimate sacrifice for strangers. And we rarely know who they are until the moment when their true character is revealed. The road is full of ordinary heroes, driving ordinary trucks, carrying ordinary cargo, until the moment when circumstances demand that they become something extraordinary. And when that moment comes, some of them, like Mike Thompson, rise to meet it with a courage that defines the very best of human nature. Let's move to our 12th and final story. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them away. David gripped the steering wheel of his freight liner as he navigated the treacherous mountain roads leading down from the Coeur d'Alene area. His trailer loaded with freshly cut timber, bound for a mill in Spokane. It was 11:30 p.m. on a bitter February night, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if his truck broke down in the wrong place. David had been hauling logs through these Idaho mountains for 14 years, ever since his discharge from the Army. He knew every curve, every grade, and every dangerous spot on this route. But tonight felt different. The paranoia had started about an hour ago, just after he'd passed through the last small logging town before entering the true wilderness. At first, it was just a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. the kind of unease that experienced drivers learn to trust. The feeling had grown stronger with each passing mile, evolving from simple caution into a bone-deep certainty that he was being watched, followed, hunted by something that moved through the forest alongside his truck. David had tried to dismiss the sensation as a product of fatigue and isolation, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. In his mirrors, he caught glimpses of movement between the snow-laden pines, dark shapes that seemed to pace his truck, maintaining the same speed despite the difficult terrain. When he slowed down for a sharp curve, they slowed down. When he accelerated on a straight stretch, they kept pace with inhuman endurance. The shapes were too large to be deer or elk, too coordinated to be random wildlife, and too persistent to be products of his imagination. The CB radio had been silent for the past 50 miles, which wasn't unusual in this remote area where mountains blocked most transmissions. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive, as if something was actively jamming the frequencies to prevent him from calling for help. David's satellite phone showed no signal, and his cell phone had lost coverage an hour ago, leaving him completely cut off from the outside world. The first direct evidence of his stalkers came when David noticed tracks in the fresh snow alongside the highway. They appeared in his headlights as he rounded a hairpin turn, running parallel to the road in the soft powder that had accumulated on the shoulder. The tracks were enormous, easily 3 times the size of human footprints, and they showed a stride length that suggested something moving at incredible speed. What made David's blood run cold was the realization that the tracks were fresh, made within the last few minutes based on how little snow had accumulated in them. Whatever was making them was not only keeping pace with his truck, but was close enough to leave evidence of its passage in the areas illuminated by his headlights. David pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his loaded truck faster than was safe on the icy mountain road. The diesel engine roared as it climbed the steep grades, and he could feel the trailer sliding slightly on the curves despite his chains and years of experience. But the alternative, slowing down and allowing whatever was out there to get closer, seemed far more dangerous than the risk of losing control. The tracks multiplied as David continued his descent through the mountains. What had started as a single set of prints became 2, then 4, then too many to count. They crisscrossed the highway, disappeared into the forest, and reappeared on the other side, suggesting a pack of creatures that was coordinating their movements and surrounding his truck. David's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the frigid air seeping through his cab. He'd heard stories from other drivers about encounters with strange creatures in remote areas, but he'd always dismissed them as tall tales or the products of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Now, faced with evidence that something was actively stalking him through the Idaho wilderness, those stories seemed far more credible. The attack came without warning as David navigated a particularly treacherous section of road that wound along the edge of a deep ravine. Something massive struck the passenger side of his cab with tremendous force, rocking the entire truck and spiderwebbing the window. David fought to maintain control as his truck skidded toward the guardrail, the trailer jackknifing slightly before he managed to straighten it out. In the brief moment when whatever had attacked him was visible in his peripheral vision, David caught a glimpse of something that defied description. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in thick, dark fur that glistened with ice crystals. Its limbs were disproportionately long and muscular, and its face combined human and animal features in a way that suggested intelligence behind the predatory instincts. The creature landed in the snow beside the road and immediately began running alongside David's truck, its powerful legs carrying it effortlessly through the deep powder. It moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, covering ground with bounds that would have been impossible for any normal animal. More creatures emerged from the forest, appearing on both sides of the highway, like ghosts materializing from the swirling snow. They ran in formation, communicating with each other through howls and calls that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. David counted at least 8 of them, all moving with the same supernatural speed and coordination. One of the creatures leapt onto David's trailer, its claws finding purchase on the metal surface despite the ice and snow. David could hear it moving across the logs, its weight causing the chain securing his cargo to groan and strain. The sound of claws scraping against bark and metal was audible, even over the roar of his diesel engine and the howling of the wind. David reached for his CB radio and began broadcasting on the emergency channel, hoping that someone, somewhere, might pick up his transmission. "Mayday, Mayday, this is southbound on Highway 95, mile marker unknown. I'm under attack by unknown hostiles. Request immediate assistance from any law enforcement in the area." The radio crackled with static, but no response came through. David was completely alone with whatever was happening outside his truck, cut off from help by the mountains and the storm. The creature on his trailer began working its way forward, moving with the confidence of something that had done this before. David could see its shadow in his mirrors as it approached the cab, and he realized with growing horror that it was trying to reach his fuel tanks. If it managed to puncture them, he would be stranded in the wilderness with no heat, no power, and no way to escape. In desperation, David began swerving back and forth across the highway, trying to shake the creature loose. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous on the icy road, and he could feel his trailer sliding toward the edge of the ravine with each turn. But the alternative, allowing the creature to disable his truck, seemed even more dangerous. The creature held on with inhuman strength, its claws leaving deep gouges in the metal as it fought to maintain its grip. David could hear it making sounds that were part growl, part human speech, as if it were trying to communicate with him or perhaps coordinate with the other members of its pack. That's when David noticed something that filled him with a new kind of terror. The creatures weren't just hunting him randomly. They were herding him, forcing him toward a specific destination. Every time he tried to change direction or take an alternate route, they would appear to block his path, leaving him no choice but to continue on the road they wanted him to travel. The realization that this was a coordinated trap rather than a random attack made David's situation far more desperate. These creatures weren't just predators. They were intelligent, organized, and experienced in hunting vehicles on these mountain roads. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather patterns, and they knew exactly how to isolate and capture their prey. David pushed his truck to its absolute limits, the engine temperature gauge climbing dangerously high as he demanded more power than the machine was designed to deliver. The creature on his trailer was joined by another, and he could feel the additional weight affecting his truck's handling. The steering became sluggish, and the brakes felt spongy, as if the creature's presence was somehow interfering with his truck's mechanical systems. The pack began to close in, with creatures running alongside both sides of his truck and more visible in the forest ahead. They moved with perfect coordination, like a military unit executing a well-rehearsed operation. David realized that he was being driven toward an ambush point, a location where the creatures had prepared additional traps or obstacles. Just as David thought his situation couldn't get any worse, he crested a hill and saw what the creatures had been herding him toward. The highway ahead was blocked by a massive fallen tree that had been deliberately positioned across both lanes, its trunk placed at the perfect height to stop a truck without completely destroying it. The creatures had been planning this trap, possibly for days or weeks, waiting for the right victim to come along. David had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. He could try to stop before hitting the tree, but that would leave him trapped and helpless while the creatures closed in. He could try to ram through the obstacle, but his truck probably wasn't powerful enough to move a tree of that size, and the impact would likely disable his vehicle. Instead, David made a split-second decision that most would never even consider. He veered toward a narrow opening in the guardrail where an old, overgrown logging road disappeared into the forest. It was a reckless move, but staying on the main highway meant certain danger. Heading into the trees was a blind risk, but one that offered the slim chance of escape from whatever was closing in. The impact with the guardrail sent shockwaves through the entire truck, but the barrier gave way under the weight of his loaded trailer. David's truck plunged into the forest, following the overgrown logging road as it wound deeper into the wilderness. Behind him, he could hear the creatures howling with what sounded like frustration and rage. The logging road was barely wide enough for his truck, with branches scraping against both sides of his cab and trailer. David had no idea where the road led, or if it would eventually bring him back to civilization. But staying ahead of his pursuers was his only chance of survival. For the next hour, David drove through a nightmare landscape of snow-covered trees and hidden obstacles, his headlights the only source of illumination in the absolute darkness of the forest. The creatures continued their pursuit, but the narrow road and dense vegetation worked in his favor, making it difficult for them to surround his truck or attack from multiple directions. Finally, just as David's fuel gauge was approaching empty, he saw lights ahead through the trees. The logging road emerged into a clearing where a small ranger station sat dark and apparently abandoned. But there was a satellite dish on the roof and what looked like a radio antenna, suggesting that communication equipment might be available. David parked his truck and ran to the station, breaking a window to get inside. The building was cold and dusty, but the radio equipment was still functional. He managed to raise the Forest Service dispatcher in Coeur d'Alene, who promised to send a search and rescue team to his location. The creatures prowled the edge of the clearing for the rest of the night, their eyes glowing in the darkness as they watched the ranger station. But they seemed reluctant to approach the building, as if something about the structure or its location made them cautious. Rescue came at dawn when a Forest Service helicopter spotted David's truck and the ranger station. The crew found David exhausted but unharmed, and they noted the extensive damage to his truck from what appeared to be large claws. But when they searched the surrounding area, they found no trace of the creatures that had pursued him through the night. The official report blamed the incident on a combination of severe weather, fatigue, and possible wildlife encounters. David's account of intelligent, coordinated creatures was dismissed as a hallucination brought on by stress and hypothermia. The damage to his truck was attributed to low-hanging branches and rough terrain. But David knew what he had experienced, and he carried that knowledge with him when he eventually returned to trucking. He never drove the Idaho mountain roads alone again, choosing instead to travel in convoys or take longer routes that kept him on busier highways with more traffic and better communication coverage. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, still using the isolation of America's remote wilderness to trap unsuspecting drivers. They were intelligent, organized, and patient, capable of planning complex operations that could take weeks to execute. Most importantly, they understood human psychology well enough to exploit our predictable responses to danger. David started sharing his story with other truckers, warning them about the dangers of driving alone through remote wilderness areas, especially during severe weather when help was far away. Some listened, but most dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a man who'd spent too much time on isolated roads. But the smart ones, the experienced drivers who'd learned to trust their instincts, began avoiding certain routes and traveling in groups when they had to venture into isolated areas. They understood that the highway was home to predators that no safety manual could prepare you for, creatures that used the vastness of the American wilderness to hunt for prey. And somewhere in the Idaho mountains, in a forest where the snow never completely melts, the creatures continue their nocturnal hunts, waiting for the next driver who will venture too far from the safety of civilization. They have learned patience from the endless winters, cunning from the harsh environment, and hunger from the isolation that keeps them hidden from the modern world. The wilderness never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt in its deepest, darkest corners, where the line between reality and nightmare becomes as thin as the ice on a mountain lake, and just as dangerous to cross. If you're a trucker with your own disturbing story, share it in the comments below. And if these stories have left you wanting more, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell. Because the highway never sleeps, and neither do the things that lurk along its edges. Drive safe out there.